Ghost stood at the edge of the world, his white fur ruffled by the icy wind blowing down from the far north. The sky overhead had abandoned the warmth of twilight and settled into the deep, star-pricked black of a frigid night. Before him loomed the wall, a remnant of the old world, forged by ancient powers and once tended by men sworn to defend the realms of humankind. In the distance, the high ice glistened beneath the faint moonlight. Ghost's breath rose in a curling mist that drifted upward and vanished among swirling snowflakes. His garnet eyes glowed with an otherworldly sharpness. Somewhere deep inside that stillness, he felt an echo calling him, a summons from a place older than the forest, older even than the north itself. He had come alone at first, slinking through frosted forests and crossing frozen rivers, guided by an instinct stronger than any call of the hunt. Jon Snow was gone, taken from him by forces that Ghost could not fully understand in the way men did. But a direwolf's senses often grasp truth and finality in ways men's minds would or could not. And so Ghost had left behind the warmth of hearths and men's companionship. When the raven's calls fell silent and the last flickers of distant battles faded, he wandered into the depth of the wilderness. Out there, in the lonely expanse where silent pines stood like ancient sentinels, Ghost sensed a stirring in the land. Some primal longing guided him northward. Instinct, memory, and perhaps an echo of the bond once shared with Jon Snow conspired to lead him toward the wall. He did not question it. One does not question a river flowing downstream or a hawk circling in search of prey. Instead, Ghost followed that silent pull. Over the course of countless days, he hunted small game and drank from still, dark pools, all while that invisible cord of destiny tugged him on. There were remnants of fighting scattered across the north, scorch marks blackening the snow, broken swords, broken bones, the faint smell of death lingering in the crisp air. The war men had waged had exacted a heavy toll on every living creature, but the land was slowly healing, encasing everything in winter's hush. Ghost's paws trod carefully around the signs of old violence, and he seldom lingered, for the pressing urge to continue drew him on. As he came closer to the wall, the trees grew sparse, their branches bent low under thick snow. A hush settled over that frozen land, so complete that it felt like entering some grand, forbidden hall. Ghost paused now and then to lift his nose, sniffing at the swirling breezes for scents of prey or predator. But all seemed quiet, in the manner of a graveyard after the mourners have departed. The nights stretched long, as if the sun itself had grown wary of shining upon this frontier of the living world. Finally, he reached the shadow of that colossal barrier of ice. It loomed overhead, silent and glacial, its face ghostly in the moonlight. In centuries past, men in black cloaks had patrolled its top, casting watchful eyes toward the lands beyond. But no torches burned atop it now. Only the wind moaned softly. Ghost stood there in the moonlight, ears perked, tail still, and waited. He could feel the swirl of old magic lingering in the ice, the same murmur that had stirred him from the forests. It was like a voice echoing through the centuries, calling to the blood of direwolves. A vow perhaps made long ago when the first men walked beside their wolf companions. That vow seemed to beckon Ghost now, urging him to gather what remained of his kin. Night after night Ghost howled at the base of the wall. His voice rose in lonely lament, echoing off the monstrous ice. On some level that longing was for Jon. But deeper than that, it was a summons to others of his kind who still breathed the north's cold air. If any direwolves yet roamed, they would hear his call. And in the hush of the night, they answered. The first to arrive was Nymeria. Though men's whispers claimed, she prowled the riverlands with a vast pack of ordinary wolves. Something had driven her northward. Perhaps she remembered the old bond with Arya Stark, or perhaps she, too, had felt the ancient magic stirring in her blood. Ghost spotted her presence long before she emerged from behind a half-buried boulder. She was a great gray she-wolf, eyes bright and stance proud. She carried on her fur the sense of distant forests and the faint tang of old battles. There were scars across her muzzle and sides, badges from her long journey and the hostilities she must have faced. But she was strong, and a keen intelligence shone in her eyes. Neither Ghost nor Nymeria greeted each other with the playful whines of ordinary wolves. They were direwolves, children of an older magic, and they locked gazes for a silent moment as swirling snow gathered between them. After a heartbeat or two, Nymeria lowered her head slightly, a gesture of respect for Ghost, acknowledging a rightness in his presence here. Ghost, in turn, licked the air softly, not so much in submission but in recognition of an equal. Their bond was unspoken, rooted in an understanding older than man's words. Ghost turned away and padded closer to the wall, where a narrow path of frozen earth curved at its base. Nymeria followed, her posture relaxed. Together they traversed the perimeter, sniffing at the old gates that once led to castles now abandoned. The wind eddied through empty courtyards, kicking up spirals of snow. In the hush, they could almost sense the faint echo of men's voices, the clang of steel, the grim determination of those who had once guarded this place. A few days passed in cold silence. Then, Nymeria howled, adding her voice to Ghost's. The sound carried across the tundra like a call of ancient thunder. It was an invocation of Pack, a beckoning to whoever still lived in the far wilds. Night after night, the two of them howled, haunting the dark sky with their reverberating cries. Occasionally, Ghost's ears perked as he thought he heard an answering echo far beyond the windy gullies. Yet it was faint, and days might pass before the echo drew closer. At last, the next of their kin arrived. The wolf that approached was massive, a hulking shadow moving against the pale snow. At first, Ghost tensed, uncertain if some monstrous predator stalked them. But as the shape drew closer, he recognized the beast's color. It was black as a moonless sky, with eyes like burning coals. Shaggy Dog. That uncanny direwolf that had once belonged to Rick and Stark now walked alone. Time had turned the pup into a powerful adult, cunning and formidable. His thick fur was matted in places and his muzzle was dusted with ice crystals. There was a faint limp in his gait, perhaps a remnant of an old wound, but nothing in his stance suggested he was weak. Shaggy Dog advanced, wariness clear in his gaze, until he was near enough to recognize Ghost and Nymeria for what they were, not threat but kin. A low rumble emanated from the black wolf's throat. Ghost and Nymeria bristled for an instant, but tension melted away when Shaggy Dog halted and lowered his head in grudging acknowledgement. They sniffed one another, circling in a quiet communion. Each carried hints of their old life, and the humans they had once been bonded to, but that existence lay behind them like paw prints in the snow. Now, the present moment, the summoning at the wall, connected them in a deeper sense. Their presence here was bigger than the man-wolf's bond. It was as if fate whispered that only by uniting might they fulfill the ancient vow. Time moved on, measured by the slow drifting of the sun across a pale gray sky and by the endless swirl of moonlight and starlight at night. Soon the nights and days blurred together in that silent vigil by the wall. Yet each new day brought a tremor in the air, a slight shift in the wind, a sense that more of their kind might be drawing near. Ghost led patrols around the deserted ruins of the fortifications, sniffing for hidden passages or sign of intruders from beyond. Nothing stirred but swirling snow and the faint scuttling of ice along cracks in the ground. Whatever threat had once loomed from the north had retreated or been vanquished. But the wall still stood, and so did the vow. At last, after many days, a new shape appeared upon the horizon. This one was lean, with a mottled gray and brown pelt bearing the stains of travel. He moved with restless energy, head low, sniffing the ground as though following a faint trail. Summer. He had once been Bran Stark's companion, part guardian and part spiritual guide. He approached with cautious speed, circling the other wolves as they watched him. Ghost observed how Summer's gaze flickered with a certain intensity, as if scanning the world not just with his eyes but with some deeper sense. Perhaps it was the bond shared with Bran, who had ventured into far stranger places than men dared to dream. Summer smelled of the old gods, of weirwood trees and ravens, of a life that had touched the mystical. "The Black Wolf," Shaggy Dog growled softly, but Summer showed no aggression. Instead, he let out a quiet whine, a greeting, or perhaps an expression of relief at finding the others here. Thus, the pack grew. Yet one was missing, one whose presence lingered like a memory of heartbreak. Grey Wind, bound to Robb Stark, had fallen in a brutal betrayal far from here. Ghost and the others felt that absence acutely. The blow of Grey Wind's loss had not only taken a life, but shattered a potential unity of direwolf magic in the world. Yet something in the wind seemed to suggest that not all was lost. Sometimes, the wolves would lift their snouts to the night sky, as though searching for a spirit. They would howl and lament, mixing sorrow with anticipation. And in the hush of the northern wind, if one listened closely, it was as if a faint echo howled back. A memory, or perhaps more. The world of men held many secrets. The world of magic, even more. In the meantime, 4 direwolves roamed along the wall. Ghost, Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, and Summer. They formed an uneasy alliance. All of them were pack in a sense, yet they had spent so long apart, shaped by different roads, with different experiences. The wild's harsh laws dictated that a new pecking order must be established, but Ghost had a quiet authority to him that the others respected without challenge. Perhaps it was because he was the only white wolf among them, or perhaps because his bond with Jon Snow had been uniquely strong and shaped by destiny. Whatever the reason, the others looked to Ghost as they wandered beneath the ancient ice. Night after night they circled the abandoned watchtowers, occasionally weaving through the labyrinthine corridors of forsaken castles. The men who had once worn black cloaks were gone, or at least no longer here. Ghost felt no spark of their presence, only the lingering ghosts of their watchful vows. Sometimes, the wolves slept in the skeleton of a great hall, beneath rotting timbers that still bore the shapes of long-gone banners. Moonlight would filter through the half-collapsed rafters, and the hiss of the wind would fill their ears. In those moments, Ghost would drift into some borderland of sleep, haunted by half-formed visions. He saw Joan's face, and at times, he thought he heard Joan's voice. But it was never quite clear. They were images of a lost bond, illusions conjured by longing. When he woke, he was once again only a direwolf, alone with his kin beneath a silent sky. Life by the wall was not easy. Hunting became scarce in the deep winter. The wolves sometimes ranged south to find game in the sparse forests. Nymeria, ever the cunning huntress, led them to hidden dens of rabbits or pockets of deer that still roamed near the edges of a frozen stream. Survival demanded constant vigilance. Yet even as they hunted, that invisible cord bound them to the wall. They always returned. This was their territory now, their shared purpose, though none of them fully understood it in the ways men might. They only knew that the wall had called them. Something in the old magic wanted them here, and so they stayed. As weeks turned to months, the storms grew fierce. Ice crusted the wolves' fur. Bitter winds tore at their ears. But direwolves are of the north, made for these conditions. Their muscles coiled with primal strength, and their fur was thick enough to shed the sting of wind and frost. Snow piled high in drifts that sometimes hid entire buildings. The gates, rusted and battered, were jammed with packed ice. The enchantment in the wall still held, but it was a silent, sleeping magic that seemed to slumber deeper as winter tightened its grip. One night, Ghost awakened from a dream. He had been running through the dark, pursuing some faceless threat. Jon had been at his side, though it was more a presence than a physical form. Then came a piercing cry, echoing from the heart of the night. Ghost snapped awake, his ears pricked, every muscle taut. Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, and Summer also stirred from where they lay curled to conserve warmth. Something, or someone, was approaching. The 4 wolves rose as one. In the silvery moonlight, the silhouette of a 5th direwolf appeared along the parapet of a half-buried tower. At first, disbelief rippled through the pack. Grey Wind had been dead. The men's stories all agreed. Robb Stark's faithful companion had been lost. But as the shape moved, they realized it was not Grey Wind's living form. It was translucent, like the wisp of breath against a glass window. The shape shimmered in the moonlight, its edges flickering as though caught in a wind that threatened to blow it away. A ghost of a direwolf, returning to the place it once belonged. The living wolves froze, uncertain how to respond. The specter lifted its head, eyes glowing faintly with an ethereal silver hue. Then it howled, a low, mournful sound that resonated not in the air, but in the mind. Ghost felt the fur rise along his spine, and he answered with a gentle whine. Even Shaggy Dog, the bristling black beast, stepped forward, ears flattened in something that bordered on reverence. Summer's tail wagged once, tentatively. Nymeria paced, uncertain, her hackles half raised. But none of them moved to chase away this spirit. Somehow, they recognized it as pack. The ghostly Direwolf padded closer, each step a soft ripple in the air, until it stood before Ghost. The two regarded each other. In that moment, Ghost felt something brush against his consciousness, a fleeting sense of memory, a swirl of recognition. This phantom had once lived, had once roamed the battlefield alongside men with stark blood. In life, Grey Wind had been known for valor and a certain fierce pride. Now, what remained was the echo of that spirit, drawn north for reasons perhaps tied to the same vow that brought the rest of them here. The vow demanded the presence of every direwolf, living or dead, to stand guard. Though the living wolves were uncertain how to incorporate a ghost among them, they soon found that the spirit was content to linger at the edges of their company. Sometimes, Grey Wind's specter would vanish at dawn, leaving the pack to wonder if it had only been a trick of the moonlight. But come nightfall, the phantom would reappear, keeping silent vigil alongside them. The world of the living and the world of spirits overlapped strangely here at the edge of the world, near the great wall of ice. Now that 5 Direwolves, 4 living, 1 spectral, had gathered, a change began to stir in the land. The cold wind blew fiercer, but beneath it lay a subtle warmth, as though the very magic that forged this barrier recognized the presence of the Direwolves. The shimmering ghost of Grey Wind often gazed outward, across the wall, into the swirling dark beyond. Something there, something in that black wilderness beckoned. Or perhaps it was merely the sense of duty that every direwolf seemed to share. Ghost felt the pull's strongest, a steady thrum in the marrow of his bones. Sometimes he would stand at the crumbled edges of the wall, sniffing the glacial wind, searching for any sign of the others, or any lingering threat. But he found nothing. Only an emptiness stretched beyond, a place so vast and foreboding that even direwolves might hesitate to tread there. Yet the vow that had drawn them here was not a vow to do battle, not yet. It was a vow to stand watch, to protect the living from anything that might once again stir in that land of ice and shadows. So they kept watch, day after day, night after night. Time slipped by, the sun crossing a pale sky that yielded to star-strewn nights. The storms came, howling with the voices of dead kings, burying old ramparts under fresh drifts of snow. And the direwolves endured, for they were as much a part of this realm as the ancient pines and the snowdrifts themselves. In scattered corners of the 7 kingdoms, rumors began to spread, soft whispers of ghostly shapes flitting at the edges of old battlegrounds, sightings of unnaturally large wolves prowling near the half-frozen lakes of the north. Some spoke of a great white direwolf leading a spectral legion at night, seen only by the pale moon's glow. Others claimed to hear howls that sounded like the voices of lost heroes. But these were but tales, drifting from tavern to tavern. The truth lay far beyond the hearing of men, at the foot of a wall that no longer needed their guardianship, for it had found new protectors. During one particularly fierce blizzard, the direwolves were forced to huddle in the remains of Castle Black. Winds shrieked across the courtyard, rattling old chains and whistling through gaps in the stone. Snow came down in relentless sheets, piling up so quickly that the wolves had to shake themselves repeatedly to keep from being buried. Shaggy dogs snarled at the storm, as though offended by its assault. Nymeria paced, restless. Summer watched the swirling whiteout with a calm, almost meditative stillness, while the ghost of Grey Wind vanished into the howling gale, only to reappear moments later, flickering in and out of visibility. All the while, Ghost stared into the storm with unwavering composure, as if seeking a sign. At one point he lifted his muzzle to the wind and sniffed. His ears perked. Something stirred out there, some presence. But was it friend or foe? He whined softly, drawing the others' attention. They, too, began to sense it. In the roar of the storm, faint as a whisper, they detected the shuffle of movement. Footsteps, breathing, living flesh. It was neither wolf nor deer. The scent was distinctly human. Despite the vow they had taken upon themselves, the direwolves had not encountered many men. Most people no longer ventured this far north. War and winter had driven them away, and the old orders of the Night's Watch had disbanded or scattered. Yet now, in the heart of the storm, a small band of humans approached, trudging onward with determined steps. Through the flurries, Ghost could make out silhouettes, a handful of figures bundled in ragged furs, clutching spears or bows. They were half frozen, stumbling in search of shelter. The pack tensed. Nymeria lowered her body, prepared to vanish into the snow and launch an ambush if needed. Shaggy Dog bared teeth. Summer crouched, uncertain. But Ghost watched closely, reading the posture of these newcomers. He recognized the stench of desperation clinging to them, a smell that spoke of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. They did not come as conquerors. They were refugees, lost souls seeking a place to survive the storm. And they had chosen, perhaps unwittingly, Castle Black. Ghost and the others slipped out of sight, blending into the drifting snow. Their pale shapes were difficult to discern in the gloom. The humans stumbled into the courtyard, cursing the wind and calling to one another. Their words were muffled, but Ghost's keen hearing picked them apart easily. "Any sign of an intact shelter?" one man called out. "There! Past those gates," answered another. A third voice, weak but resolute, added, "We'll freeze to death if we don't find a room with a fireplace." They found the old mess hall, or what remained of it. With trembling hands they attempted to light a fire. Sparks flew as flint struck steel. Nymeria and Shaggy Dog watched from the shadows, while Ghost and Summer skirted around, ensuring there were no others lurking about. Soon a feeble flame crackled in the darkness, giving the humans enough warmth to survive another night. In the flicker of that firelight, Ghost could see their faces more clearly. They were young, not quite boys, but not yet the hardened warriors who'd once patrolled these halls. Their eyes were bright with fear, their hands raw with cold. One among them wore a tattered black cloak, reminiscent of the Night's Watch uniform, though it was clear he was no brother of the Watch in oath. Perhaps he'd scavenged it for warmth, or perhaps he was a deserter from another time. Nevertheless, here they were, 5 living humans in a place now guarded by direwolves. The wolves kept their distance, but they did not attack. Something in their instincts recognized the futility of harming these pitiful creatures who posed no threat. Still, the humans soon became aware that they were not alone. They heard the occasional scrape of claws on ice, the rustle of paws shifting in shadows, the low rumble of a growl. They froze, spears clutched in trembling hands. In moments they saw glowing eyes in the gloom, eyes that seemed to burn with intelligence beyond any normal beast. Terror rippled through them. One of the humans lifted his spear, fear contorting his face. Another reached for the bow strapped to his back. But the third, the one wearing the black cloak, stepped forward, heart pounding, and lowered his weapon. In a trembling voice he muttered, You're direwolves. By the gods, never thought I'd see one, let alone more than one." His words faltered as the white wolf emerged from behind a broken wall. Ghost stood there, silent, his red eyes fixed on the humans, the snow swirling around his massive frame. The man in black cloak swallowed hard, but lowered his spear entirely, letting the tip rest on the ground. The others followed his lead, though warily. They sensed that any sudden aggression might provoke a swift and brutal end. It was a strange tableau, men huddled around a meager fire, direwolves lingering in the darkness just beyond. The flame crackled, illuminating drifting flakes. Neither side moved. Then the man in the black cloak spoke again, voice trembling not just with cold, but with awe. "We didn't come to fight," he said softly. "We only want to survive the storm. If this is your territory, we can leave once the snow stops." He knew he was addressing animals, or so logic told him. But some part of him understood that direwolves were no ordinary beasts. He'd heard enough stories of the Starks, of the war, of the bond between men and wolves. The man's eyes flicked to Ghost's white fur, and a spark of recognition lit in his gaze. Perhaps he'd heard rumors of a white direwolf whose master was Jon Snow. Perhaps he recalled that the wolf was called Ghost. A swirl of legends, half remembered, danced through his mind. Ghost watched him, and though the direwolf did not speak, there was communication in his posture. He made no move to attack, no snarl to chase them off. Yet there was no invitation in his stance either, merely a measured acceptance. In that silent exchange, the man in the black cloak understood. They could remain as long as they did not threaten the pack, so long as they brought no harm to this sacred domain. So the men settled in, huddling around the fire for the night. Ghost and the others withdrew to their dens, though they remained vigilant. The bond between men and wolves had been shattered so many times in the past, trust was tenuous. But for that one night, in the midst of a howling storm, there was an unspoken truce. Come dawn, the blizzard finally relented. Sunlight glimmered on the snow, painting the vast courtyard in dazzling white. The men, stiff and cold but alive, looked around nervously for signs of the wolves. They saw pawprints in the snow, large as a man's hand, weaving in and out of sight. Steam rose from the remains of the fire, and beyond that, the half-ruined wall stood silent. One of the younger men inhaled sharply, pointing at the footprints. Gods, he murmured, look at the size of them. Those beasts could tear us apart in seconds if they wanted. The man in the black cloak turned, scanning the perimeter. He thought he glimpsed a flash of white fur near a drift, but as soon as he blinked, it was gone. A chill ran down his spine, though not entirely from fear. There was something mesmerizing about the idea that these legendary beasts patrolled the lost strongholds of the Night's Watch. He remembered the stories his grandmother told him, of men who swore oaths to guard the realms of men, of the Direwolves who once marched with the Stark children. And here he was, alive in the midst of a domain now held by the wolves. It was as though an ancient prophecy had come to pass. They might have left then, returning south to safer lands, but the man in the black cloak hesitated. He gazed at the wall's looming face of ice, the thickness of its ancient magic. Something pulled at him, a vestige of the vow he'd once considered taking, or perhaps a longing to be part of something greater than himself. He knew it was madness. The North was no place for the unprepared. Winter devoured men's flesh as easily as any beast. Yet his eyes traced the footprints in the snow, and he found himself whispering, "They're not just beasts, they're guardians." His companions looked at him uncertainly. "Guardians," repeated one, as though the word made no sense in this context. The man in the black cloak lifted his gaze to the top of the wall, remembering old tales of the Night's Watch and their tireless vigilance. "Hey," he said, "Guardians, didn't you see the way they protected this place? We could have been killed. They let us live. That means something." The others exchanged uneasy looks. "Maybe they're just waiting until we get fatter," one joked nervously. But none of them laughed. They all felt the same heavy significance in the air. The man in the black cloak allowed his eyes to drift shut for a moment. He recalled a time when he was a child, watching crows circle the top of the wall as if in silent warning. There had been an allure to the idea of swearing the oath, of becoming a shield that guarded the realms of men. But life's hardships had led him astray. He ended up a wandering soul, drifting from one war-torn region to another. Yet now he stood here, in the presence of direwolves, in the ruins of a place once sacred to a greater cause. It stirred something in him that he could not name. Meanwhile, Ghost and his pack watched from a distance, each wolf crouched behind drifts or broken walls. They studied the men's movements, waiting to see if they would depart. When the men lingered, the wolves did not immediately drive them away. This land was vast, and if these humans wanted to freeze themselves trying to reclaim a fraction of castle, so be it. The wolves would remain, regardless. Days passed, and the men found ways to survive. They scavenged the old armory for scraps of wood to burn. They picked through storerooms, discovering salted meats that were half-rotten but still edible when boiled. They set snares for rabbits at the edge of the courtyard. And always, they felt the eyes of the Direwolves upon them. At night, the howling began again. First Nymeria, then Shaggy Dog, then Summer, and Ghost. Last came Grey Wind's ghostly wail, echoing across the frosty emptiness. Those mournful cries made the men's hair stand on end. They listened, hearts pounding, uncertain if the wolves were warning them or serenading the moon. But the men did not flee. Somehow they found a grim comfort in knowing that if any threat crept across the ice to harm them, it would first have to face the direwolves' jaws. As time went on, a fragile coexistence emerged. The men ventured a short distance to hunt or gather wood, and the wolves prowled the perimeter. Sometimes, out of the corner of an eye, a man would see a flash of gray fur or glowing red eyes. It would send a jolt of adrenaline through him. But no attack came. Once, the man in the black cloak approached the courtyard where Ghost stood in plain sight, The direwolf watched him come closer, only a few paces away, without snarling or running. A sense of awe coursed through the man. He could see every strand of that white fur, the faint scars across Ghost's snout, the powerful muscles beneath. But those red eyes held no malice, just a silent warning. "We allow you here," they seemed to say, "but do not forget whose domain this is." The man lowered himself slowly, adopting a non-threatening posture, though he did not dare reach out to touch the wolf. He felt as though he were in the presence of a king. Looking into those eyes, he remembered hearing that Ghost had belonged to the rightful king in the north, Jon Snowretiri. No one knew for certain what had become of Jon, though rumors abounded that he journeyed beyond the wall and never returned. Some said he died fighting the Night King. Others claimed he'd wandered deeper into the wilds. The man in the black cloak wondered if a part of Jon still resided in Ghost's spirit. Perhaps that explained the direwolf's uncanny sense of purpose. Eventually, the man rose and backed away, leaving Ghost unchallenged. He went to his companions. The youngest among them asked, "Did you try to pet him?" The man shook his head with a nervous laugh. "I'd prefer to keep my hand." And the others nodded, comprehending the unspoken truth. These were not dogs to be tamed. They were direwolves, children of the old gods in the ancient north. Winter ground on, punishing them all. Food grew scarcer. The men whittled down their meager supplies. The wolves, too, found the hunt difficult in the relentless snows. Yet there was an unspoken link forming. When the men managed to fell a deer, they left the carcass in the courtyard after taking their share. Later, they'd find the bones picked clean, with enormous paw prints circling the spot. In this way, a rudimentary bond formed. The men took what they needed to survive, and the wolves took the rest. Neither side fully trusted the other, but necessity and mutual respect can forge strange alliances. One night, however, that balance was tested. A hungry man is prone to desperate thoughts. While the man in the black cloak was out scouting the perimeter, one of his companions dared to think that a direwolf's pelt would be worth a fortune in the southern markets. Perhaps the wolves were dozing somewhere. Perhaps a single arrow could change their fortune. He took his bow and ventured out into the snowy courtyard, scanning for a target. He spotted a shadow moving along the outer wall. Slowly, he raised his bow, nocked an arrow, and drew the string back. Before he could release, an eruption of white fury came out of the corner of his vision. Ghost lunged silently, a blur in the snow. The man had no time to cry out. He was knocked off his feet, bow clattering away. Ghost's weight pressed him into the drifts. Jaws parted, revealing terrible fangs close to the man's throat. Terror and adrenaline flooded the human senses. He tried to scream, but only a strangled croak escaped. In the wolf's eyes, he saw something akin to wrath. The wrath of the north itself, cold and unforgiving. Footsteps pounded behind them. The man in the black cloak rushed onto the scene, spear in hand, only to stop dead at the sight. Nymeria and Shaggy Dog emerged from behind, forming a semicircle, ears laid back. Summer, too, padded out, silent and deadly, while the ghost of Grey Wind flickered in the shadows. It was clear the entire pack was ready to tear the fool apart if Ghost gave the signal. The pinned man whimpered, tears freezing on his cheeks. His heart hammered so loudly he couldn't hear his own ragged breath. He was certain these were his last moments. But then the man in the black cloak did something unexpected. He set aside his spear and knelt in the snow. Slowly, carefully, he inched forward, palms outstretched to show he held no weapon. His gaze flicked from Ghost's fangs to the terrified eyes of his companion. He spoke softly, though his voice trembled. He meant no harm, he lied, hoping to calm the beast. He was just frightened, hungry. Please, spare him. Ghost growled, a low rumble that vibrated through the man's chest. The direwolf's breath steamed, hot and reeking of raw meat. Bloodlust glinted in those red eyes. But somewhere in Ghost's memory, or perhaps in his blood, lingered the bond with Jon, the memory of men who were once allies rather than prey. He hesitated. The man in the black cloak bowed his head, as if praying. "I swear," he whispered, "if you let him live, he will never threaten your kind again." For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then Ghost let out a final snarl and stepped back. He allowed the wretch to scuttle away, trembling from head to toe. The pack did not scatter, though. They stood fast, bristling, ready to tear the man apart if he made a single wrong move. The man scrambled to his feet and darted behind the man in the black cloak. But Ghost and Nymeria kept their gazes locked on him as if to say, "We will not forgive a second offense." Shaken, the man in the black cloak turned to his companion and hissed, "Are you mad? They could have killed you, and us." The other man could barely speak, stuttering apologies, claiming desperation. But the man in the black cloak shook his head. "No more. If we stay here, we live by their rules." From that moment on, the men dared not even whisper about harming the wolves. The tenuous bond that formed was sealed by a show of deadly force. They understood that these direwolves were no ordinary beasts to be bested or hunted. They were guardians, and the watchers of this realm now answered to them. As the final stretch of winter dragged on, the men improved their rudimentary shelter, patching holes in the walls, clearing out debris. They even managed to coax a half-ruined smithy into functioning enough to repair a broken spear tip or sharpen an old blade. Meanwhile, the wolves continued their nightly patrols. They roamed the base of the wall, venturing sometimes atop it through old tunnels that the humans dared not climb. The ghost of Grey Wind drifted like an ethereal sentinel along parapets where men's footprints had vanished centuries ago. Sometimes, the wolves encountered strange sights. Old White Walkers' remains turned to icy dust, shattered whites lying beneath drifts. The threat had receded, but echoes remained. Yet the Direwolves' presence seemed to keep those shadows at bay, as if the residual magic in their blood was anathema to the cursed remnants of the long night. One morning, Shaggy Dog dragged something out from a hidden cleft in the ice, an ancient skeleton, half encased in frost, wearing the tatters of black armor. Perhaps a ranger from ages past. The wolf left the bones exposed to the elements, as if offering a silent funeral to the wind. Through it all, Ghost felt a growing sense of calm purpose. He led the pack along every corner of the abandoned fortresses, Castle Black, East Watch by the Sea, and the others that dotted the wall's length. The journey took weeks, for the storms often made travel perilous. But the Direwolves persevered, guided by that vow that pulsed within them like a second heartbeat. In ancient times, men had built the wall, but men and Direwolves together had once faced the darkness beyond. That legacy lived on in Ghost and his kin. The presence of the small human band in Castle Black became a kind of background hum in Ghost's awareness. They posed no threat if they remained respectful. Sometimes, the man in the black cloak would stand up on a broken rampart, looking out at the swirling horizon, half hoping to see something stir. He felt the kinship with the wolves, an unspoken sense that he too was bound to guard the realms of men, even if no formal vow crossed his lips. As the snow began to recede with the first timid hints of spring, the men considered leaving to find a more hospitable home. But the man in the black cloak lingered. He had grown attached to this place, attached in some strange way to the idea that the wolves were carrying on the old oath. And a part of him wanted to do the same. His companions grew restless, but one by one, they admitted they felt safer here, behind the watchful presence of 5 Direwolves. Perhaps they had nowhere else to go. Perhaps they had discovered a kind of purpose in these ruins. And so they stayed, forging a life at the threshold of the living world, under the guardianship of Ghost and his pack. One crisp morning, the sky was so clear it seemed carved from blue crystal. Ghost was out patrolling near a breach in the wall where a chunk of ice had fallen away during the Great War. He could sense something beyond it, a shift in the wind. Intrigued, he crept closer, ears pricked. Summer, curious, followed at a distance. The ghost of Grey Wind flickered along the edges of sight, a silent wraith scanning the horizon. In the distance, a herd of caribou grazed on patches of moss. Ghost's stomach rumbled. Food would be welcome after such a lean season. He dropped low, creeping across the snow. Summer mirrored him, maintaining a flanking position. Slowly, methodically, they stalked closer. One of the caribou lifted its head, ears twitching. Before it could bolt, Ghost sprang. The chase was swift and lethal, direwolves bounding across the ice with unnatural grace. In moments, they isolated a weaker caribou, felling it with coordinated bites. The rest of the herd scattered. Satisfied, Ghost and Summer tore into the fresh kill, gulping down warm mouthfuls of meat. They heard movement behind them. Tensing, they spun around, hackles raised, prepared to defend their kill. But it was only the man in the black cloak, stumbling across the snow, spear at the ready. He froze at the sight, uncertain whether to approach. Blood dripped from Ghost's muzzle as he stared the man down. For a tense moment, they measured each other. Then the man lowered his spear. In a slow, cautious gesture, he removed a small pouch from his belt and held it out, letting the breeze carry the scent of dried meat or some grain. He was not offering to trade exactly, but it was a gesture of camaraderie. Ghost's ears flicked with curiosity. He stepped forward warily. Summer stood back, lips curled slightly in a warning. But the man just knelt, keeping his eyes averted, as if to say he meant no disrespect. Ghost sniffed the pouch. The smell was meager compared to the fresh kill, but something in the man's offer conveyed more than food. It was a recognition of the bond between them, an extension of trust. Ghost did not snarl or snap. He merely allowed the man to place the pouch on the ground. Then Ghost turned back to the kill, resuming his meal. The man exhaled in relief, as though passing a test. He too was hungry, but he recognized that the caribou was the wolves' prize. Instead, he took a step back and watched in silent reverence as Ghost and Summer fed. Such moments, though small, began to thread a delicate tapestry of understanding between the wolves and the men who had chosen to remain. Slowly, the old ghosts of distrust receded, replaced by a mutual acknowledgement. They all belonged to this domain now. The men might gather wood, repair walls, and keep small fires burning, but it was the direwolves who governed the nights, prowling beneath the auroras that sometimes danced across the northern sky. Spring arrived in fits and starts, the snow crusting and thawing, revealing patches of gray earth beneath. Sparse buds dared to open on the twisted shrubs that survived in the shadow of the wall. The man in the black cloak spent his days repairing sections of the courtyard, scavenging old beams to reinforce crumbling walls, as if hoping to see Castle Black stand strong again. Sometimes, he would climb onto the rampart and gaze north, shading his eyes from the glare of the sun on ice. He never saw more than the vast wilderness stretching on endlessly. Yet he felt that as long as Ghost and the others kept watch, no ancient horror would slip by unnoticed. Once, the man thought to venture beyond the wall, to see what lay in the frozen wastes. He made it only a mile or two, trudging over a bleak landscape of glacial cracks and rocky outcroppings. The cold still bit deep, and the sense of emptiness was overpowering. He heard the howls of the wolves drifting on the wind, and it felt like a warning. Some frontiers are not meant for casual exploration. Humbled, he turned back. When he reached the wall again, he spotted Shaggy Dog watching him from a ledge of ice. The black wolf's gaze was unwavering, as though judging the man's intentions. He let the man pass without aggression, but it was clear who controlled this territory. Summer found him later, sniffing around his footprints. The wolf's posture was not hostile, merely curious. Perhaps Summer recognized in the man a lingering bit of Stark loyalty, or perhaps it was simply the acceptance that had grown over these months. The man knelt, murmuring nonsense words, half comforting, half in awe. Summer tilted his head, ears twitching, then patted away. A silent conversation passed between them, leaving the man feeling strangely uplifted. In time, other wanderers came. A lone woman wrapped in furs, half dead from starvation. Then a handful of wildlings fleeing some internal feud beyond the hills. All stumbled upon Castle Black. They found the small band of humans barely scraping by, guarded by direwolves of immense size and eerie intelligence. Word spread quietly through these travelers. Rumors crept south, whispering of the wolf pack at the wall. Some claimed it was an omen of a new age of wolves, others scoffed it off as legend. But for those with no place else to go, the rumor was a beacon of hope. They came seeking refuge, expecting to be chased off or devoured. Instead, they found ghostly sentinels that only attacked if threatened, and a small band of humans determined to revive something of the Night's Watch spirit. So the trickle of arrivals grew. A ragtag community began to form within the crumbling walls. They had no formal leadership, only a few figures who naturally took charge, among them the man in the black cloak. He taught them what he knew about the old fortress, about building fires in hidden hearths, about fortifying doors against prowling beasts. Yet the greatest protection still came from the direwolves. At night, the howling reminded everyone that the real power here belonged to those ancient creatures. The men, Women and children who gathered respected that boundary. No one wanted to provoke the pack's wrath. Ghost and his kin watched from the periphery, guiding these newcomers without direct involvement. Sometimes the wolves would join hunts in the nearby forests, driving game into the path of the men's spears. Other times, they vanished for days on solitary patrols along the wall. The spirit of Grey Wind remained the most elusive, appearing only under the moonlight, gliding among the newly built fires as a silent guardian. Yet, collectively, these direwolves held the entire region in a protective grasp that extended beyond men's limited understanding. Among the newly arrived was an old woman who claimed to be a green seer. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, and she hobbled with the aid of a twisted staff. She spoke in riddles, muttering about the children of the forest and the old gods that watched through weirwood trees. She seemed drawn to the direwolves, whispering that they carried the spirit of the ancient north within them. Whether she truly possessed powers or merely the wisdom of old age, no one could say. But she offered guidance and comfort to those who listened. She claimed that the presence of all these direwolves united under the White One, host, signaled a renewed covenant between nature and man. That the vow of the Watch lived on, though men had forgotten it, and only the wolves remembered. Some listened enthralled by her words. Others shrugged it off as fancy talk from a senile old woman. Yet her message settled into the community like seeds in fertile ground. Slowly, people began to speak of themselves as watchers, not official members of the Night's Watch, for they had not taken any vow, and some were women or children, but watchers in spirit, living under the guardianship of the Direwolves. They planted small gardens where the snow melted, gathered and stored food for the next winter, and prepared to remain for the long term. This was their home now. The wolves had offered them a sanctuary on the edge of the world. In return, they treated the wolves with reverence. Months turned to years. The illusions of summer warmth came and went. The settlement grew, shaping Castle Black into a modest refuge. Walls were rebuilt, roofs patched, farmland painstakingly carved out of the harsh ground. Smoke curled from chimneys. Children played in the courtyard, cautious but fascinated whenever one of the Direwolves strolled by. Often the children would halt their games, eyes wide as a massive figure padded into view, Shaggy Dog or Nymeria, ears twitching at the laughter. Parents watched nervously, always ready to snatch their children away if the wolves showed any sign of aggression. But the wolves rarely paid more than passing attention. In a curious way, they had accepted the presence of these humans, so long as respect remained. Ghost became a near-mythic figure among them. He rarely lingered in the courtyard, preferring the solitude of the ramparts or the quieter halls. People would catch a glimpse of white fur drifting among shadowy corridors, or see the faint red glow of his eyes at night. Children whispered daring stories of how, if you climbed the highest tower at midnight, you might see Ghost perched there, watching the sky as if communing with the moon itself. Occasionally, those who were out hunting before dawn claimed they encountered the wolf, striding across the frost-covered terrain, majestic as a king on patrol. The rumors spread that if you were lost in the woods at night, Ghost might appear to guide you back. Whether or not that was true, no one could say for sure, but stories have a way of shaping reality. Meanwhile, Nymeria occasionally ranged far south, returning after weeks or months. Some said she led a pack of regular wolves that roamed the riverlands and beyond, ever connected to her. Yet she always came back to the wall, as though drawn by the vow she shared with Ghost. Shaggy Dog preferred to remain closer, prowling the outskirts, roaring his deep growl at any sign of threat. Summer, gentle yet formidable, often helped the hunts, moving in fluid silence alongside the men who dared to leave the safety of the castle. Grey Wind's Ghost never strayed far from Castle Black, appearing at odd hours, sometimes pacing along the top of the wall, other times wandering the courtyards as an eerie silhouette. Some of the bolder residents tried talking to the specter as though it were a lost spirit that could be soothed. They never received a response, only that silent gaze and a fading shape that disappeared into moonlight. Yet the real test of their unity came when a new threat emerged. Word reached the castle of a group of raiders moving south from beyond the Frostfangs, a warband of cruel men who had turned cannibal to survive the endless winter. They had no respect for the old ways or new alliances. They preyed on small villages, looting, burning, leaving death in their wake. Rumors said they were making their way toward the wall, eager to plunder any settlement they found there. Fear seized the community within Castle Black. They had come to rely heavily on the wolves for protection against the monstrous and unnatural. But these were men, savage and desperate. Some worried that the Direwolves might not intervene in a conflict that pitted men against men. The old woman with the milky eyes insisted that the vow of guardianship extended to all threats. The Direwolves would stand fast, she said, for evil was evil, whether wearing a mortal face or something else. But no one could be certain. They prepared defenses as best they could, fortifying gates, standing watch on half-repaired battlements. Though not a true night's watch, they formed a semblance of guard shifts. The man in the black cloak took command, though he did so reluctantly, urging them to remain vigilant. Days passed in tense waiting. Whispers carried on the wind that the raiders were close. Then one evening, as the sun dipped behind the wall, the alarms went up. A watchman spotted figures creeping across the snowfields, dozens of them, armed with axes, spears, torches. The raiders had arrived, hungry for blood and loot. They advanced with the cunning of predators, thinking to catch the settlement unprepared. But the men on the walls shouted warnings, and soon the settlement was a flurry of activity. Fires lit, weapons brandished, doors barred. The raiders let out whoops of savage glee, expecting an easy conquest. They were soon corrected. A chorus of howls split the twilight, so loud and resonant it seemed the earth itself quaked in response. From the shadows emerged shapes, Direwolves' fur-bristling teeth bared. Shaggy Dog was first, bounding toward the intruders with a thunderous snarl. Nymeria came from the flank, silent and swift. Summer raced alongside them, muzzle contorted in a fierce growl. Ghost appeared almost as if materializing out of the darkness, his white fur a stark contrast to the gloom. And behind them, flickering like a specter of doom, glided Grey Wind. The sight of 5 direwolves, each the size of a small horse, struck terror into the raiders. Some hesitated, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Others, whipped into a frenzy of desperation, charged forward, hurling spears and curses. But direwolves are not so easily felled. They scattered the assault, leaping through the snow in coordinated strikes. Jaws clamped down on arms, legs, throats. Shrieks filled the air. Those who turned to flee found Shaggy Dog already behind them, or Nymeria slashing their hamstrings in a blur of claws. Summer's massive form bowled over a knot of raiders, sending them sprawling into the drifts where they were swiftly silenced. Ghost tore into the invaders with a cold fury that seemed to echo Jon Snow's final stance. Blood flecked his white fur, but he never faltered. Arrows that flew haphazardly from the raiders' bows mostly missed, and those that struck the wolves only grazed or clattered off thick fur. It was chaos, a swirling melee of wolves and screaming men, but the outcome was never truly in doubt. The Direwolves fought with primal savagery and supernatural coordination. The settlers inside the castle watched in grim fascination, some firing arrows from the battlements or charging out to aid in the fight. But the wolves needed little assistance. They unleashed a storm of retribution upon the raiders, each kill driving the rest to panic. Soon, the surviving handful broke and ran. Yet even as they fled, Nymeria and Shaggy Dog pursued, ensuring they would not return. The man in the black cloak, having ventured onto the field with spear in hand, stared at the carnage in awe and horror. He realized that though the wolves had been peaceful protectors to them, they were also creatures of lethal power, unstoppable when roused. When the last of the raiders were dispatched or scattered, the wolves regrouped near the gates. Ghost, panting, muzzle stained red, locked eyes with the man in the black cloak. The man bowed his head, not in subservience, but in deep gratitude. Without the wolves, the settlement would have been overrun, slaughtered. The vow held. The direwolves guarded these humans as part of their domain. That night, around the fires, the settlers spoke in hushed tones of the power they had witnessed. Some were shaken by the brutality, others emboldened. But all agreed that they now lived under the guardianship of a force both ancient and unyielding. In the days that followed, the settlement buried their dead and tended their wounded. The Direwolves bore their own injuries, a few arrows in Shaggy Dog's flank, a gash along Nymeria's haunch. But direwolves healed quickly, and within a fortnight, they were again roaming the snowy plains. The settlement resumed its slow work of rebuilding, more convinced than ever that their mission, whatever it was, had meaning. The vow to guard the realms of men continued, expressed not through the formal words of a long-disbanded order, but through the silent, watchful presence of the Direwolves and the humans who heeded their example. Time wore on. Seasons turned. The children grew, learning to respect the silent watchers. Some even swore a new oath, inspired by the legends of the old Night's Watch. They recited the words to each other in the courtyard, their breath steaming in the cold air. Night gathers, and now my watch begins. It was a ceremonial gesture rather than an official vow, but it carried significance. Whenever they finished, they looked to the top of the wall, half expecting to see Ghost's white silhouette or to hear the echo of Grey Wind's spectral howl. And sometimes, on particularly cold nights, when the auroras shimmered across the sky like shifting ribbons of green and purple, the entire pack gathered near the highest parapet. Ghost would stand at the precipice, staring into the cosmic dance above, while Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, and Summer flanked him. Grey Wind's spirit hovered nearby, luminous in the swirling lights. Those below who dared to look up felt a strange awe, as though witnessing a ritual older than humanity. The Direwolves howled, their voices weaving with the crackle of the aurora, forming a symphony of the wild. And in that moment, it felt like the North itself was alive, that the old gods listened, and that the vow was reaffirmed. These Direwolves stood guard, united, forever watchful against any darkness that might return. As the years rolled on, legends crystallized around the wolves of the wall. Bards who ventured north claimed to witness a sight that defied mortal understanding. 5 Direwolves, 1, a phantom, ruling the domain once manned by the Night's Watch. They spoke of how the White Wolf led them, how they patrolled the ramparts in ghostly silence, how their howls at night kept the nightmares of the long night at bay. Some said the wolves would outlive mortal men, that as long as the wall stood they would remain, answering an oath sworn in blood and magic. Others claimed they were the living embodiment of House Stark's words. Winter is coming, and that as long as their vigil continued, winter would come but never fully consume the world. Beyond the 7 kingdoms, life continued. Wars broke out, kings rose and fell. But at the far edge of civilization, where the wind never ceased its icy song, the Direwolves upheld a promise made in ages long past. With each passing day, the bond between wolf and land grew stronger. Even the ravens that nested near the old rookery cawed less in fear, more in watchful curiosity. The entire environment seemed shaped by the presence of these powerful beasts, locked in an unending cycle of vigilance. The children of the settlement grew to adulthood, passing on the stories of Ghost and Nymeria, Shaggy Dog and Summer, and the mysterious ghost of Grey Wind. A new generation took up the mantle of watchers, forging new arrows, maintaining the old gates, always aware that their true protectors prowled just beyond the torchlight. Some speculated about what would happen if another great threat came, another horde of the dead, another Night King. Would the Direwolves alone suffice to hold it back? No one knew, but the mere possibility that they might gave hope to those who endured in this frigid realm. In time, the Direwolves' presence became as much a part of the North as the snow and the wind. They were woven into every breath, every footstep, every pulse of the land. Ghost especially came to symbolize an unwavering promise, an unspoken contract between mortal kind and the ancient spirits of the wild. If you listened closely at night, you could hear the vow in the howls, echoing off the wall and reverberating across the starry vault. We are here. We remember. We stand guard. Those who ventured far enough north, braving the endless cold, might catch a glimpse of a white wolf leading a pack of giants across the frozen plain, or see the faint silhouette of a wolf, made of moonlight gliding among them. In awe and trembling wonder, they'd return to warmer lands with stories that few believed. Yet the legends lived on. Mothers told children of the eternal wolf pack, guardians of the night. Soldiers around southern campfires swapped tales of how a single pack kept the savage wilds at bay. Even the maesters, typically skeptical of rumor, recorded a few credible reports, concluding that something indeed occupied the wall, something beyond simple wolves. And so, across endless winters and fleeting summers, the Direwolves endured. Ghost, white as snow, red-eyed, unwavering, was the heart of that pack. Nymeria, proud and cunning. Shaggy Dog, fierce and untamed. Summer, serene and perceptive. and Grey Wind, the silent spirit that never rested. Together they were bound to the wall, bound to a vow forged in blood and sorrow when the creatures of ice once threatened all life. Though men came and went, though new families rose in Castle Black and old ones died out, the Direwolves did not waver. Age touched them slowly, if at all, as though the magic that tied them to this place preserved them in a timeless vigil. If one were to stand at the base of the wall on a moonlit night, they might see 5 silhouettes arrayed against the shimmering ice, howling a song that spanned centuries. That sound was a reminder of a truth too often forgotten by the realms of men. Some bonds transcend the mortal coil, some vows are eternal, and some guardianship is never relinquished. The Watchers in Black once manned these ramparts, but now the Watchers were direwolves, living and dead, united in purpose. And thus, the wall remained guarded, forever. In the hush that followed each nightly chorus, the wind itself seemed to speak, carrying the memory of countless battles and lost heroes. If you listened, truly listened, you might think you heard the voice of Jon Snow murmuring from beyond time, urging Ghost onward, or the voice of Bran calling Summer home, or even Robb Stark, whose companion never truly departed. The Direwolves bore the fragments of those memories in their blood, in their spirits, and the vow lingered on. So it was, and so it would be, so long as Ghost and his pack roamed the north. They were the keepers of the darkness, ensuring it never spilled unchecked into the kingdoms of men. They were the living legacy of a bond that once connected Stark children to their loyal beasts. And though the world beyond the wall might forget their names or dismiss them as legends, the Direwolves did not need recognition or titles. They had the wind, the snow, the ancient ice, and the silent vow. That was enough. Thus ended the wars of men for the Direwolves. No longer were they scattered, no longer divided by war or distance. United under Ghost, they forged a peace more potent than any treaty, sealed not with words but with unbreakable instincts. The children of the settlement flourished under their guardianship, new houses sprouted, old stories found new voices. All the while, the wall stood, an enduring line between civilization and the unknown. But it stood no longer alone. It had its defenders, both flesh and spectral. And in the stillness of winter nights, their howls serenaded the stars, a timeless warning to any darkness that might rise again. For as long as those howls echoed in the night, it meant that the wolves still kept faith with their ancient vow. Men might falter, forget, or betray their oaths. But Ghost, Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, Summer, and the spirit of Grey Wind would not. They were Direwolves, children of a magic beyond mortal ken, guided by an unspoken, unbreakable bond. Together they kept the watch. Together they guarded the wall forever. Another year passed in that austere realm of snow and wind, and the life unfolding at Castle Black continued to evolve in unexpected ways. The ragtag community that had gathered there, once a handful of desperate souls, had slowly grown into a small but resolute settlement of survivors. The battered old walls, restored piece by piece, now contained a modest tapestry of human voices and echoes of ancient vows. Some people sang the old songs around shared fires, while others busied themselves with chores, patching roofs, carving spears, tending small gardens in the narrow slivers of earth that emerged when the snow receded. Amid these signs of fragile prosperity, the Direwolves still roamed, ever watchful, their presence woven into the fabric of daily life. The man in the black cloak, a figure who had once stumbled into Castle Black half-frozen and uncertain, had become a quiet leader by default. His hair, dusted with streaks of gray, marked time's passage. People called him different names. Some joked that he should be called Lord Black Cloak or Ghost's lieutenant, but he never answered to anything but a soft grunt or a humble nod. He had not taken any official vow, nor did he style himself as the new Lord Commander. Still, the folk gravitated toward him in moments of crisis. He alone had gained some measure of confidence from the Direwolves. He did not control them, for no man could, but in times of confusion, he seemed best able to interpret their silent signals and keep others from making foolish mistakes. Ghost, for his part, remained the central pillar of that unspoken covenant between wolf and man. Often he was elusive, patrolling the top of the wall or venturing into the frozen forests beyond. Days could pass without anyone catching more than a fleeting glimpse of white fur weaving through the gloom. Yet, whenever alarm arose, a sudden commotion, a threat from outside, or tension within, Ghost would appear, eerie and silent, his red eyes surveying the scene with preternatural calm. His presence alone quelled disputes, for who would dare unleash violence while a dire wolf loomed just beyond the torchlight? Nymeria, untamed and fiercely independent, still ranged south whenever the urge took her, leading her own offshoot pack of ordinary wolves across the riverlands. She might vanish for a moose turn, only to reappear at Castle Black as if drawn home by an invisible tether. Those intervals away did nothing to diminish her stature among the direwolves or the humans. Whenever she returned, scars or trophies from distant hunts marked her fur, and she prowled the courtyards with an aloof grace that made people whisper that she was more of a queen than any noblewoman ever crowned. Shaggy Dog had grown heavier in the body, his black fur tinged with a few patches of silver around the muzzle. Yet no one mistook that for true old age. He was as savage and uncompromising as ever. Children learned to give him wide berth. Even the bravest among them would not try to pet him or offer scraps. Shaggy Dog snapped at outstretched hands, and more than one adult bore the memory of a near miss with his fangs. He kept to the outskirts of the settlement, prowling along the partly rebuilt palisade or lurking near the half-collapsed stables. He was the first line of defense against anything that crept out of the night. For all his fierceness, he never attacked without cause. But woe to the stranger who tried to sneak into the castle unannounced. Shaggy Dog's low growl was often the last sound they heard. Summer was a paradox, calm, thoughtful, and deadly when roused. He had formed a curious bond with several of the settlement's younger hunters. Often he accompanied them on foraging excursions beyond the gates, cutting down the risk of ambush from wild animals or roving outlaws. Where Shaggy Dog's presence put humans on edge, Summer's company provided a sense of reassurance. Some of the more spiritually inclined folks claimed to sense in Summer the echoes of a powerful greenseer, that old link to Bran Stark. Perhaps that connection, though indescribable to mortal tongues, still hummed in the direwolf's blood. Summer's gaze seemed to pierce veils of time and memory. Even those who scoffed at magic found themselves unsettled by the intelligence in his eyes. And Grey Wind's spirit continued its silent patrols, never speaking or interacting in ways that men could easily interpret. By now, nearly everyone in the settlement had glimpsed that ethereal silhouette. Sometimes, it drifted through a wall like mist. Other times, it stood watch atop a broken tower, luminous under moonlight. Once, after a newborn child died in her mother's arms, the mother swore she saw Grey Wind's ghost padding through the corridor, pausing at the threshold of the small chamber, as if drawn by grief. But the spirit had merely blinked its glowing silver eyes, then vanished. Whether Grey Wind came to carry the child's soul, or simply to share in the sorrow, no one could say. The child was buried in the new graveyard at the castle's edge, and people whispered that in the deep of night, the ghost of Grey Wind sometimes stood near the fresh mound, mourning with them. The old green seer woman, she whose milky eyes hinted at deeper sight, had not long for the world. Over the last few years, her back had grown more bowed, her breath more labored. She spoke less often, and her muttered riddles were softer than before, like a distant echo of the person she'd been. People still came to her with questions, seeking any shred of prophecy or guidance, but she offered cryptic half-phrases. "The door that was closed may open once more," she whispered one morning to the man in the black cloak. When he inquired further, she only shook her head. Days later, she told a group of youths that the old god slept lightly, stirring at the edges of dream. "If they dream again in anger, even direwolves may tremble," she said. Most did not know what to make of her words. She died quietly in her sleep at last, nestled in a corner of the old common hall where she had made her bed. A hush settled over the community when the news spread. The settlement gathered to cremate her body on a pyre outside the walls, chanting bits of the old prayers she had taught them. A gentle snow fell, cloaking her ashes. Just beyond the firelight, the silent shapes of direwolves watched, eyes reflecting the flames. A collective shiver passed through the onlookers, as if they were reminded of how thin the line was between life and mystery. In the following weeks, the sense of transition weighed heavily on the settlement. Without the old woman, some of the hopeful or fearful who had sought her wisdom felt unmoored. Whom would they go to when strange dreams plagued them or when they needed an omen interpreted? The man in the black cloak did his best to shoulder more responsibility, but he was no mystic. He led by practicality, instructing them on how to shore up the walls, how to ration food during a lean hunt, how to avoid provoking the Direwolves. Nevertheless, that intangible something she had provided, call it spiritual guidance, prophecy, or comforting superstition, was gone. Yet the old woman's passing also spurred a quiet determination among many. They began building a small sanctuary within the walls, a place of reflection devoted to the old gods of the north. Though no one claimed to be a formal priest or a caretaker of weirwoods, they used timbers from fallen trees in the haunted forest and erected a modest shrine. At its heart stood a tall carving reminiscent of a weirwood face, though not fashioned from a living weirwood. It was only the best they could do with the materials at hand. People came there in the hush of early morning, lighting candles or leaving tokens, bits of carved stone, feathers, small animals made from straw. The settlement had developed a culture of its own, blending ragged practicality with a reverence for unseen powers that seemed to swirl around the Direwolves. Life continued. One spring, if it could be called spring in the North's perpetual chill, a group of travelers arrived. 3 men and 2 women, escorted by a squad of broad-shouldered mercenaries in patchwork armor. From the vantage point of the castle walls, watchers saw that the travelers rode on horses draped in heavy furs. The standard they carried was unfamiliar, a simple black banner with a white hand in the center. The man in the black cloak called down to them, asking their business. The visitors shouted back that they were envoys seeking a rumored place of safety and trade at the wall. They had heard men live there under the guardianship of ghostly beasts. They came bearing wares, spices from the east, salt, bits of copper, and small steel blades they hoped to barter for furs or other northern goods. Though the watchers hesitated, such a large group might be dangerous, they were also intrigued by the offer of goods. The settlement had precious little in the way of trade. After some debate, they decided to grant the travelers provisional entry, opening the battered gates. Shaggy Dog prowled near the threshold, fangs bared, as the horses gingerly picked their way onto the courtyard's packed snow. The mercenaries stared in awe at Shaggy Dog's eyes at the ragged scars that marked his body. It was one thing to hear tales of direwolves. It was another to stand close enough to smell their hot breath. The group was led by a wiry man named Harris, who claimed to hail from lands far south of the Neck. He stepped forward, black hair whipped by the frigid wind, and tried to bow graciously to the man in the black cloak. "My thanks for your hospitality," he said. His voice carried the lilt of someone used to navigating negotiations. "We've heard remarkable tales of this fortress and its guardians. We wish to see if those tales are true." Before the man in the black cloak could respond, Shaggy Dog let out a growl that seemed to rumble in everyone's bones. Harris flinched, nearly losing his composure. The man in the black cloak raised a hand, palm out, hoping to placate Shaggy Dog. "You'll keep your weapons sheathed and your intentions honest," he said to Harris. "Otherwise, you won't last an hour here." Harris nodded vigorously. Behind him, one of his companions, a woman swathed in furs, muttered something about the size of the wolf. A mercenary clutched a spear, knuckles white, but another laid a hand on his arm, warning him not to provoke the beast. The newcomers were led to the old common hall, now partially refurbished into a gathering place. Smoke from the central hearth drifted up through a hole in the roof. There, they sat on crudely fashioned benches among the settlers. Eyes flicked warily at one another, humans measuring the measureless. What sort of place was this, truly? The travelers marveled at the large braziers, the racks of dried fish and venison, the walls hung with improvised tapestries. Everything was patched, mended, or salvaged from earlier ruins. Yet, there was a certain order to it all, a sense of communal purpose that Heroes and his people found intriguing. As the hours passed, they began to negotiate. Harris displayed small sealed clay jars containing pungent spices from across the sea. He had lumps of salt from a southern mine and polished copper bangles. In exchange, he wanted northern furs, especially those rumored to come from the giant wolves. The man in the black cloak's expression hardened at that last request. "No direwolf fur will be sold here," he said firmly. "If that's what you came for, you should leave." Harris raised both hands in a show of apology. "I meant no offense. I only heard rumors that your people might harvest the fur of, let's say, other large animals. Perhaps even the occasional monstrous predator that roams these parts." He glanced around nervously, as if searching for the ghostly shape of a white wolf. But if that rumor is mistaken, forgive me. I am happy to trade for simpler wares, deer hides, wolf pelts from your hunts, perhaps even the horns of moose or elk, if you hunt them. We'll pay well." A hush lingered as the settlers weighed the proposition. Having a reliable trade route could bring much-needed resources. But they all understood the precarious relationship with the Direwolves. Harvesting wolf pelts from normal wolves that roamed too near might be acceptable, but only if the Direwolves did not interpret it as a threat to their kin. They had seen the lethal consequences when humans crossed certain lines. Eventually, a tentative deal was struck. The settlement would provide a limited quantity of ordinary wolf pelts, deer hides, and carved bones in exchange for salt, spices, and some steel arrowheads. The travelers would remain for a few days to confirm the goods, and then depart. During that time, they were not to wander the castle alone, not to approach the Direwolves, and not to trespass near certain areas, like Ghost's favored tower or the small sanctuary of the old gods. Heros and his entourage agreed. By the next morning, they started trading in earnest. The presence of outsiders caused excitement among the children, who peered around corners giggling at these travelers with accents and trinkets from distant lands. The older folks were more guarded. They remembered past times when strangers brought betrayal. The man in the black cloak remained watchful. Each night he walked the ramparts or the courtyards with a spear in hand, ensuring no foolish mercenary tried to climb the towers or slip a blade into an unsuspecting settler. He found comfort in the knowledge that if anything truly dire occurred, the Direwolves would intervene far more swiftly than he could. On the second night, as the small community slept, a bone-chilling howl pierced the silence. It was not the pack's usual nightly chorus. It carried a note of alarm. Many people woke in their bunks, hearts pounding. The man in the black cloak rushed to the courtyard. There, near the main gate, he saw Shaggy Dog pacing, his hackles raised. Nymeria and Summer were emerging from the shadows, teeth bared. Ghost stood on the parapet above the gate, staring down at a figure who lay slumped in the snow. It was one of Heros' mercenaries, a tall, gaunt man with a pockmarked face. He was still alive but clutching his side, moaning in pain. Blood smeared his hands. The man in the black cloak approached cautiously, gesturing for the wolves to hold back. He knelt by the wounded man, pressing a hand to the gash near the mercenary's ribs. The cut was deep. "What happened?" he asked, but the mercenary only groaned. By then, Heros and the other travelers had arrived, torches in hand. They gasped at the sight of their injured comrade. One of them wailed. He left the hall after dark, said he wanted to see something. I told him not to wander off. They turned to the man in the black cloak for help. "Please, if you have a healer." A few of the settlement's folk came forward with bandages and cloth, though they were no maesters. They lifted the injured mercenary and carried him inside. But suspicion flickered in the man in the black cloak's mind. The wolves only attacked when provoked or when a violation of their domain occurred. "What was he doing at the gate?" the man demanded quietly as they hurried inside. Heros looked troubled. "I don't know. Perhaps he wanted to check on our horses, or—" A faint whimper from the wounded man made them hush. Inside the firelit hall, they laid him down, stripped away his bloodied furs, and began cleaning the wound. He was conscious enough to mutter curses under his breath. As they stanched the bleeding, the man in the black cloak pressed him for answers. "Did you provoke the wolves? Were you trying to leave?" The mercenary finally managed to speak. I just wanted coin," he rasped. "The rumors about direwolf fur, thought maybe I'd earn a fortune, sell it." He licked his parched lips, eyes rolling with pain. "I climbed, tried to aim my crossbow at the big black one from the parapet." His words trailed off, lost in agony. Nearby, Heros cursed under his breath. The crowd that had gathered hissed in dismay and anger. One of the settlement's older men spat at the floor. "Bloody fool," he murmured, shaking his head. He had to know that was a death sentence. The man in the black cloak felt a surge of cold rage, tempered by grim resignation. This was exactly the sort of incident he had feared. A single act of greed could provoke dire consequences for everyone. He glared at Heros. "You swore your people would respect our rules." Heros held up both hands, desperation in his voice. "He acted without my approval. Please, You must believe me. I would never betray our agreement. I know the stories. I know the wolves are not to be trifled with. He was just a fool. He gestured to the wounded man who was losing color in his cheeks. We'll take responsibility for his actions, but please, help him if you can. They tried their best. The settlement's de facto healers pressed poultices to the wound, attempting to stanch the flow of blood with cold water and cloth. But the bite, indeed, it seemed more than one direwolf had torn into him, was severe, the flesh ragged, bones possibly fractured. By the first glimmer of dawn, the mercenary's breathing had grown shallow. The man in the black cloak watched from across the hall, arms folded, wrestling with conflicting emotions. If the man died, it might cool the direwolves' anger, but it could also spark resentment from the travelers. The direwolves themselves were nowhere in sight during the final hours. They had dealt their blow and withdrawn. As dawn's pale light filtered through the cracks in the hall, the mercenary let out a final rattling breath and grew still. Harrows bowed his head, tears pricking his eyes. Even though the mercenary had been a fool, he was still a companion, a man Harrows had shared the road with. The rest of the travelers stood in somber silence. It fell to the man in the black cloak to break that silence. We will grant him the same rights we give our own, he said. If you wish to bury him outside the walls or burn him, that's your choice, but you must leave by tomorrow. The wolves will not tolerate your presence any longer, not after this. Harrows swallowed hard. We understand, he murmured. We'll gather our things. But perhaps we could still complete our trade? We want no quarrel. We traded fairly, and this tragedy was one man's error. After conferring briefly with some of the settlement's folk, the man in the black cloak agreed to let the exchange finish. They would offer the goods they'd promised, but the price now included the travelers leaving without further incident. Harrows accepted. By midday, they had buried their fallen comrade in the frozen ground outside the castle, reciting quiet prayers. Then they hurried to finalize the trade, solemnly and efficiently. No one was in the mood for leisurely haggling. Before sunset, the visitors rode out through the gates, mindful of the shapes lurking on the battlements. The last glance Heroes cast backward revealed Ghost, perched on a ledge of ice like a silent wraith, watching them depart. After they were gone, the settlement tried to return to normalcy, though the mood remained tense for several days. Some speculated that trade could bring new life to Castle Black, but others warned that outsiders always arrived with hidden agendas. The man in the black cloak found himself torn. He recognized the importance of building some kind of trade network. Without it, they survived in complete isolation, reliant solely on what they could scavenge or hunt. But how many times could they risk greedy or ignorant strangers provoking the direwolves? He resolved to be more selective in welcoming travelers, though he knew that word of their existence would continue to spread. One night he confided to a few of the older settlers that if the settlement grew too large, it might undermine the very peace they had built. We stand on a knife's edge here, he said quietly, between men's ambition and the wolves' vow. Time carried them onward in its unrelenting current. Seasons blended, though in the far north, the difference between summer and winter was measured more in degrees of chill than in any abundance of warmth. New children were born in the settlement, pale-faced, wide-eyed infants who grew up hearing direwolf howls as a lullaby. A few older folks passed away, their bones laid to rest in the growing graveyard. People planted small gardens during the brief weeks when the ground thawed enough to yield a little green. Carrots, onions, and hardy northern vegetables managed to survive the short growing season, augmented by wild herbs found deeper in the forest. Hunting parties brought in game, salt fish from the northern coast, or the occasional bounty of mushrooms from damp caves. In all of this, the direwolves remained the axis around which the settlement revolved. Their presence was constant, reassuring to some and unsettling to others. Ghost Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, Summer, and the flickering ghost of Grey Wind, 5 guardians, one of them neither alive nor fully gone. Though each wolf had its own habits and territories within the old fortresses along the wall, Castle Black served as a nexus, a place they all returned to eventually. The vow they had taken, so inscrutable in human terms, bound them in a silent circle of duty. And that vow extended to all who lived within the wolves' domain, provided they respected the invisible boundaries. The man in the black cloak sometimes marveled that mere men had somehow found acceptance in the Direwolves' watch. One autumn, a rumor reached the settlement that a small group of wildlings, those free folk who once lived beyond the wall, were migrating south. They had lost their home to a terrible calamity, strange, unnatural creatures prowling in the northern wastes. The rumor came from a breathless traveler who claimed to have encountered them on the edge of the haunted forest. "They're half-starved," the traveler said, "but they carry the old ways with them. If they come here, will you turn them away?" The settlers debated the question. Many feared that wildlings, historically at odds with the people of the Seven Kingdoms, might cause trouble. But others argued that the settlement itself was a collection of cast-offs from different lands. Why should they refuse others who needed shelter? Finally, the man in the black cloak concluded that if the wildlings approached, they would be given a chance, provided they understood the rules. Then, as so often happened, he looked to the direwolves. If the wolves allowed these new arrivals, so be it. Weeks passed with no sign of wildlings. The traveler who had brought the rumor disappeared westward, continuing his own journey. Autumn blended into the early threats of winter, the sky darkening earlier each day. Snow fell in thin flurries at first, then heavier storms. Hunting parties ventured out less often. People stocked wood and salted meat, preparing for the harsh season. No one forgot the rumor, but as days stretched on, it began to feel like another wild tale. Then, one bitter afternoon, Shaggy Dog's furious howling echoed around the walls. Settlers rushed outside, fumbling with cloaks and weapons. The black wolf was at the main gate, his body stiff, fur bristling as he barked and snarled at something beyond. From atop the parapet, the man in the black cloak squinted at shapes in the swirling snow. Slowly, through the white haze, figures materialized. They were indeed wildlings, men, women, a few children, led by a tall, raw-boned man with long, tangled hair. They raised empty hands, spears pointed to the ground in a gesture of surrender. The tall man shouted up through the wind, "We come in peace. We seek shelter. The dead men walk again in the far north. Maybe you've seen them. We need a safe place to survive winter." "Nai-nan." A murmur rippled through the settlement. The old tales of White Walkers still lingered like a nightmare on the edge of living memory. Most believed that threat had been vanquished forever during the long night's last stand, but who truly knew what horrors might still prowl in the polar night? The man in the black cloak tensed. If these wildlings were honest, turning them away could mean condemning them to die. But if they were lying... He glanced at Shaggy Dog, who was mere steps away from launching an attack. The black wolf's growls reverberated through the ice. From behind the tall man stepped a lean woman with a face weathered by frost and hardship. She lifted her chin, voice shaking from cold but resonating with resolve. "Your wolves may kill us if you refuse," she said. "But we have nowhere else to go. We'll die of hunger or worse if we turn back north. Let us in, or put us out of our misery now." A hush descended. The man in the black cloak considered his own memories, how he had once arrived at Castle Black with nothing but desperation. Then he gave the order to open the gate. Shaggy Dog snarled, but he did not lunge. The gate creaked open, and the wildlings shuffled inside, eyes darting at the looming wolf. Nymeria and Summer materialized from the swirling drifts, forming a semicircle behind the newcomers. Ghost, regal and silent, watched from atop a half-collapsed walkway, his red eyes locked on the scene below. The tall man introduced himself as Thenar, though he said he was not of the Thens. He told them of how, beyond the wall, strange lights had been seen in the sky, and rumors of wights emerging from hidden caverns. "We've lost more than half our kin," he confessed, voice raw with sorrow. "Vanished in the night. Some said they heard ice cracking, footsteps of the dead. I don't know if it's fancy or truth, but we couldn't stay." The settlement took them in cautiously. A portion of the common hall was cleared, providing space near the hearth. The new arrivals had few possessions and even less food. But they were strong, resilient people, used to surviving in hostile conditions. Once they realized that the direwolves were the true power here, they showed no hostility, only wary respect. Over the following days they integrated with minimal conflict. A few men from the settlement scowled at the wildlings, recalling old feuds or stories of raids. But time and necessity have a way of mending ancient divides when survival is at stake. And so Castle Black's population grew again. New voices joined the dawn chores. New children stared wide-eyed at the towering wolves that shared their home. In the evenings, the wildlings sang unfamiliar songs in a halting mix of the common tongue and their own dialects. Some of these ballads spoke of the White Walkers who once terrorized their ancestors. The settlers listened in uneasy fascination, glancing around for signs of the direwolves. But the wolves rarely entered the hall when it was crowded. They preferred to keep their distance, watchful and aloof. Yet the wildlings' arrival also brought troubling questions. If there truly were signs of whites or worse in the deep north, did that mean the ancient menace had returned? Or were these just the phantom fears of traumatized survivors? The man in the black cloak talked privately with Thenar, prying for details. "We saw footprints," Thenar insisted, "in places where no living man should tread. They led to caves in the glacier. Some men went to investigate. None came back." News of this conversation filtered through the settlement, heightening anxieties. The old horrors might not be as thoroughly banished as people wish to believe. The man in the black cloak found himself torn between the urge to investigate and the imperative to defend the castle. If something stirred out there, the direwolves might sense it well before men. Perhaps they already did. As winter deepened, the nights stretched longer and the wind howled more fiercely. The direwolves took on a new intensity in their patrols. Ghost disappeared for a week, leaving watchers to guess where he had gone. Summer and Nymeria ranged out for days at a time, sometimes returning with fresh kills or with their fur caked in ice. Shaggy Dog remained near the gate, his vigilance redoubled, as if expecting a threat from outside at any moment. The ghost of Grey Wind roamed the ramparts at night, flickering in the corner of men's vision like a living omen. In midwinter, the temperature plummeted so low that the slightest breeze felt like knives against the skin. The settlement huddled indoors, fires blazing around the clock. Food stores dwindled, forcing them to ration carefully. Hunting became nearly impossible when even the animals had retreated to hidden dens or migrated. The direwolves fared better, with their immense stamina and heightened senses, but even they seemed pressed by the severity of the cold. During this time, a strange phenomenon lit the northern sky, dancing ribbons of red and pale green, more vivid than any previous aurora. People gathered in the courtyard, ignoring the cold for a few moments to stare upward in awe. Some claimed to see shapes in the lights, wolves chasing stags, or ghostly figures with spears of ice. The wildlings muttered nervously, recalling legends that such displays heralded the awakening of dark powers. The settlers whispered that the old gods must be stirring. No matter one's beliefs, the sky was a mesmerizing tapestry of color that seemed both beautiful and ominous. That very night, Ghost returned. He came padding through the gate, massive paws silent on the frozen ground. A hush fell over the courtyard as those present saw the state of him. Blood matted part of his flank and jagged scratches laced his white fur. He was clearly wounded, though still upright and proud. Summer appeared behind him, limping slightly, likewise bearing fresh injuries. Nymeria was nowhere to be seen, and Shaggy Dog raced from his post to join them, sniffing their wounds, growling in agitation. Grey Wind's ghost materialized near the top of a battered staircase, head low, eyes reflecting the dancing sky. Alarmed, the man in the black cloak approached cautiously, a few others at his side. Ghost met his gaze without flinching. In the wolf's eyes, the man thought he saw urgency, a warning or a plea. The wolf bared his teeth, not in aggression, but in a silent snarl that carried a message no human words could encapsulate. Summer's injuries looked less severe than Ghost's, but still significant. Both wolves bore the stench of something foul, an odor that reminded the man in the black cloak of rotten ice. One of the settlers retched at the smell. The wildlings recognized it instantly, the stink of undead flesh. A ripple of dread coursed through the onlookers. Questions flew in panicked whispers. Had the direwolves encountered whites out there? Were the White Walkers truly back? The man in the black cloak reached out, but Ghost shifted away, favoring his wounded side. Ever so gently, the man set a hand on the wolf's uninjured flank, letting Ghost sense his intent. He and a couple of the braver settlers tried to clean the wounds, using scraps of cloth and warm water. Ghost let them, though he rumbled low in his throat whenever they caused pain. Meanwhile, Summer circled restlessly, eyes scanning the walls as if expecting an attack at any moment. Shaggy Dog's reaction was more primal. He threw his head back and howled at the swirling auroras, a long, baleful cry that raised the hairs on every neck. The sound echoed across the empty plains, magnified by the towering wall. Grey Wind's spirit answered with its own wraith-like howl, sending ice down spines. That eerie duet hung in the air, as if announcing something had changed beyond the threshold of the known world. Nymeria did not return that night, or the next. Ghost and Summer spent most of their time recovering in the courtyard, but restlessly so, as if they yearned to be back out there. Shaggy Dog paced at the gate, refusing to leave his post. The settlement was gripped by fear. Some demanded they seal the gates, barricade the walls, and pray to whatever gods might listen. Others whispered that an offensive approach might be needed. Maybe they should gather a party and follow the wolves' tracks, see what lurked out there. The wildlings argued that this was madness. If the Direwolves barely escaped alive, how could mere men fare any better? Amid this turmoil, the man in the black cloak wrestled with the burden of leadership. He knew the settlement was in no state to fight an unknown menace, especially one steeped in the dark powers of ice and death. But he also recognized that cowering behind walls offered no guarantee of safety. If something as fearsome as a white or worse was on the prowl, it might just outweight them or find a more vulnerable approach. Memories of the old stories, the long night, the battles of Jon Snow and the Starks, had never felt more present. He found himself standing at the top of the wall one evening, the wind battering his hood, gazing across the endless white. Ghost limped beside him, silent as always. In that expanse, anything might be stirring. Who was to say the darkness had truly been vanquished generations ago? A decision had to be made. In the end, it was Ghost who made it for him. Once the wolf had regained enough strength to move without staggering, he began whining at the gate, turning in circles, staring pointedly at the man in the black cloak. Summer joined in, stepping back and forth restlessly, occasionally sniffing the path leading out into the open. It was clear they wanted to go north again, to find Nymeria or to confront whatever threat lay beyond. The man in the black cloak felt a knot form in his chest. If the wolves went alone, they might vanish into the cold and never return. If he accompanied them, he risked losing everything if they failed. But he couldn't ignore the call. And so, in the hush before dawn, he mustered a small band, only the hardiest volunteers from the settlement. Thenar the wildling offered to join, citing his people's familiarity with the terrain. 2 more wildlings came along, plus 3 settlers who had proven their mettle on hunts. They gathered warm furs, weapons of steel and dragonglass, kept as relics from older battles, though no one remembered exactly how they'd come by them, and enough provisions for a few days' travel. The rest of the settlement stood in the courtyard, silent and anxious, as the group prepared to depart. Ghost led the way out the gate, Summer at his flank. Shaggy Dog stood at the threshold, growling in disapproval, but made no move to follow. Perhaps he deemed it more important to guard the castle. Or perhaps he distrusted humans so deeply that he refused to rely on them in a fight. Either way, the expedition set forth without him, trudging into the twilight, breath steaming in the sub-zero air. Grey Wind's specter watched from a high rampart, eyes glowing faintly. Then it vanished, as if carried off by the wind. They traveled northward across the frozen waste, guided only by Ghost's instincts and the faint tracks of direwolf paws left by Nymeria. The journey was brutal. Wind scoured their faces, and the chill seeped into bones despite their layers of fur. The occasional stand of skeletal trees offered meager shelter. Thenar proved invaluable, identifying hidden paths and cautioning against treacherous ice near half-frozen rivers. Sometimes they stumbled on old footprints or the remains of a campsite, but whether those belonged to Nymeria's path or others, they could not tell. On the second day, they crossed a wide, windswept plain. The cold had hardened the snow into a crust, making each step crunch loudly. In the distance, they spotted a shape, huge, black, unmoving. At first, dread twisted the man in the black cloak's gut. It could be a monstrous beast. But as they drew closer, they realized it was a giant elk, frozen stiff, half buried in a drift. Its body had been torn open, innards strewn about. The kill was fresh enough that birds hadn't picked it clean yet, suggesting a predator had been here recently. Ghost sniffed the air, ears flattening. Summer whined softly, eyes scanning the horizon. The party tensed, each hand gripping a spear or sword. But they saw no sign of an attacker. Whatever had done this was long gone, or lying in wait. That night, they made camp near a small outcrop of rocks. The wind was merciless, so they huddled in a shallow hollow, building a fire that danced weakly against the dark. Ghost and Summer kept watch on the perimeter, their silhouettes just visible in the flickering light. The man in the black cloak dozed fitfully, haunted by dreams of an endless army of glowing-eyed whites marching across the tundra. He woke with a start to find Thenar staring into the flames, face drawn. "I've seen men lose their minds from less," the wildling muttered. "We're chasing ghosts in a land of ghosts." The next morning the storm eased slightly, enough for them to press on. Hour by hour, the terrain grew harsher. Ice cracked underfoot, revealing black water beneath. They had to weave carefully between dangerous crevices. Finally, around midday, Ghost halted at the edge of a towering shelf of ice. Summer joined him. Both wolves lowered their heads and let out low growls. The man in the black cloak approached, heart pounding. What lay beyond that shelf might be the answer, or the doom, he sought. He peered over the icy edge. Below lay a ravine carved by some ancient glacier. Its depths were dark, the walls slick with frost. In the gloom he could just make out a cave entrance yawning like a hungry mouth. Though the wind whipped around them, the air in that ravine seemed unnaturally still, as if it were waiting. No footprints were visible from above, but a faint sense of movement flickered in the corner of his vision. He squinted. "There," he whispered, pointing to where a shape flickered, something large with pointed ears and a lean muzzle. A direwolf. Could it be Nymeria? Thenar and the others crept to the edge, eyes wide. The shape moved deeper into the cave, vanishing. Ghost made a restless sound, stepping forward as if about to leap into the ravine. The man in the black cloak caught the wolf by the fur. "Careful," he muttered. "We can't just jump down." They looked for a safer way to descend. Eventually they found a narrow path winding along the rocky side, partially hidden by snow. One by one, they inched down, ice crunching underfoot, hearts pounding. Summer and Ghost went first, sure-footed despite their injuries, as if drawn by an irresistible pull. The bottom of the ravine was deathly silent. Snow lay thick, muffling their steps. The entrance to the cave loomed overhead, blackness framed by jagged icicles. An unearthly chill wafted out, colder than the winter air itself, carrying a faint reek that made their stomachs turn. The man in the black cloak's breath caught in his throat. He felt an almost magnetic repulsion, as if every instinct screamed at him to stay away. Yet he pressed on, quietly drawing his sword. The others followed, weapons ready. Thenar gripped a torch in one hand, though lighting it felt risky. Any glow might draw attention. But they needed some measure of sight in that gloom. The man in the black cloak stepped into the cave, followed by Ghost and Summer, then Thenar, the other wildlings, and the two settlers. Their eyes struggled to adjust. The torch flickered, revealing dripping walls of ice that shimmered like glass. The stench of decay intensified. They advanced slowly, each footstep echoing in the silence. A tunnel curved inward, and faint shapes flickered at the edge of the torchlight. Then they saw it. Nymeria lay on her side, breathing shallowly, her fur streaked with blood and frost. The great she-wolf's flank rose and fell in ragged intervals. Her eyes, yellow as candles, were open but unfocused. A deep gash marred her hind leg, and her muzzle was caked with dried blood. Ghost rushed to her side, sniffing, whining softly. Summer stood guard, head low, teeth bared. The man in the black cloak knelt beside Nymeria, ignoring the risk. He placed a trembling hand against her flank. Her body was cold, but warmth still lingered deep within. She was alive, just barely. A low hiss emanated from the darkness beyond. Torchlight flickered across the ice, dancing over half-seen shapes. Something moved, hunched and unnatural. Then it emerged, a white, once human, its skin stretched tight over gray flesh, eyes glowing with bluish luminescence. Its jaw hung slack, and shards of ice clung to its tattered garments. It advanced with jerky steps. The party froze in terror, but they were prepared. A wildling let loose a spear. It struck the white's chest, staggering it. Another settler hacked at it with a dragonglass dagger. The white shrieked, crumpling to the floor. More shapes emerged behind it, moaning, eyes lit with ghostly fire. Chaos erupted. Ghost and Summer lunged, ripping at the undead with jaws that crushed bone and sinew. The humans swung swords, spears, anything that might hold them back. The echoes of battle filled the cave. In the torchlight, the man in the black cloak saw more whites crowding toward them. Half a dozen at least, maybe more. He realized with a chilling certainty that they were in a nest of the undead. The only chance of survival was to fight their way out or burn them. "Fall back!" he shouted, hacking at a white that lunged for his throat. He swung his blade in an arc, severing the creature's head, which rolled away, eyes still flickering. A second white grabbed one of the settlers, biting into his shoulder. The settler howled in pain. Then R drove his spear into the white's skull. Icy shards splintered outward. "Get Nymeria if you can," the man in the black cloak roared, though how they would drag the wounded direwolf out, he had no idea. Ghost was already nudging Nymeria's flank, urging her to stand. Summer guarded them, snapping at any white that ventured close. Nymeria struggled to rise, staggering on her injured leg, a snarl twisting her muzzle. She was formidable even wounded, but the extent of her injuries made movement agonizingly slow. The group formed a desperate shield around her, cutting down whites as they tried to retreat toward the tunnel entrance. One of the wildlings tossed the torch onto a cluster of whites advancing from the rear, hoping to ignite them. The whites hissed and recoiled, but the damp environment provided little fuel. Every second counted. The man in the black cloak felt his breath burn in his lungs, each exhalation visible in the frigid air. The whites were unrelenting, clamoring forward, driven by some malevolent force. More advanced from deeper in the cave, as if an entire legion dwelled within. Fear swelled in him. This was a losing battle if they could not escape. He slashed at another white, severing a limb. Then R impaled one that got too close. Summer and Ghost tore into the undead with savage ferocity, muzzle fur stained black with congealed gore. Nymeria snarled as she limped, refusing to be left behind. At last they reached the mouth of the cave, stumbling into the gray daylight. With no time to rest, they half-pushed, half-carried Nymeria up the narrow path. White spewed out of the cave behind them, climbing the slope with unnatural agility. One settler, already wounded, slipped on the icy path and tumbled into the ravine. His scream abruptly cut off as multiple whites closed on him. The others had no choice but to press on, adrenaline pounding. Once they gained the upper rim, the man in the black cloak shouted, "We need fire! Cover!" One of the wildlings fumbled with flint and steel, trying to ignite another torch. Then R hurled a spear at the first white cresting the edge, knocking it back into the ravine. Ghost and Summer stood at the brink, snapping at bony hands that clawed the ice. Finally the torch flared. Another of the group grabbed sacks of pitch from a pack. With trembling hands, they splashed it over the lip of the ravine and hurled the torch after it. Flames erupted, running down the slope, catching the whites as they clambered up. Screeches filled the air as the undead burned, the fire crackling with a sickly light. The man in the black cloak prayed it would be enough to halt, or at least slow the wave of horrors. "We can't stay," then R barked, eyes wild. "They'll keep coming if there are more inside." The group nodded frantically. Supporting Nymeria as best they could, they fled from the ravine at a staggering pace. Ice-laden wind buffeted them, as if the land itself conspired to hamper their escape. Each step felt precarious, but survival instinct drove them on, refusing to yield to exhaustion or shock. Ghost snarled at the rear, ensuring no white broke through the line of retreat. They pressed on for hours, unmoored from any sense of direction but away. At last, they paused in a cluster of rock formations that offered scant shelter from the wind. Nymeria collapsed, sides heaving. Blood seeped anew from her wound, and the man in the black cloak feared she might not make it. He knelt beside her, desperate for any remedy. Then R rummaged through their supplies, producing bandages and a small vial of strong spirits. They cleaned and wrapped the wound as best they could, ignoring Nymeria's feeble growls of protest. Ghost hovered, whining low, occasionally licking Nymeria's muzzle as if urging her to fight on. One of the settlers was missing, lost in the cave, devoured by the whites. Another was badly injured, the shoulder bite turning black at the edges. He sweated despite the cold, muttering deliriously. The group recognized the old terror. The bite of the undead could spell doom, a slow corruption that might turn the living into a white. But they had no advanced knowledge of healing such wounds. They only had raw resolve and the faint memory of older wars. In the end, they decided to treat it as any severe infection. They cleaned and cauterized the wound with a heated blade, ignoring the man's agonized screams. Then they bound him tight, praying it would forestall whatever curse the whites carried. They huddled around a small fire, taking turns on watch, each mind haunted by the scene in the cave. The next morning, they began their return trek to Castle Black. Even with Nymeria's injuries, they dared not linger. Fear of being overtaken by more undead propelled them, though the reality of traveling with a wounded direwolf was grueling. Nymeria limped valiantly, refusing to be carried, snapping at anyone who tried. The man in the black cloak had never felt more powerless. Here he was, a mere mortal, trying to save one of the mightiest creatures in the north from a fate that he only half understood. The memory of the whites gnawed at him. They were out there, possibly in large numbers, awakened by some dark stirring. The vow of the direwolves was not in vain. The threat they guarded against might indeed be rising. On the third day, they spotted Shaggy Dog in the distance. The black wolf came racing over a snowdrift, hackles up, as if scolding them for straying so far. He bounded toward Nymeria, sniffing her injuries, then whipped his head around and let out an enraged growl that carried across the ice. Summer joined him, nuzzling to show unity. Ghost, ever silent, simply stepped forward to press his muzzle against Shaggy Dog's flank. For a moment, the man in the black cloak witnessed a reunion that was as much about shared sorrow as it was relief. The pack had been tested, nearly shattered, but they were together again. They reached Castle Black by dusk, nearly collapsing from fatigue and cold. The inhabitants rushed forward, relief and horror mingled in their expressions. They helped the wounded settler inside, laid him near the fire, and called for whatever rudimentary medical knowledge they possessed. The man in the black cloak oversaw Nymeria's careful transfer to a sheltered corner of the courtyard. The direwolf refused to be hemmed in, but at least accepted some hay and a blanketing of furs. Summer hovered protectively, baring his teeth at anyone who came too close. Ghost paced, eyes flicking from Nymeria to the gate, as though expecting an attack at any moment. Shaggy Dog prowled the ramparts, howling intermittently, a signal that set every nerve on edge. Word spread fast that whites had been found in a cave, and that the group barely escaped with their lives. The people of the settlement gathered in frightened clusters, whispering about the last war against the dead, about the legends they had so often considered exaggerations. Venar, battered and exhausted, confirmed the horrifying details to his wildling companions. "It's true," he told them, voice hoarse. "They walk again. The dead roam these lands." Panic threatened to unravel the fragile order. Some advocated fleeing south, scattering before the undead could mass. Others insisted the wall was still a bulwark of magic, that it would protect them somehow. A few recalled the old adage that dragonglass and Valyrian steel could kill the White Walkers, but they had neither in sufficient quantity. The man in the black cloak found himself at the center of a storm of questions. He held up a hand for silence. "Running blindly south won't help," he said firmly. "We'd starve or be picked off by raiders. And if this threat truly marches, it might follow us anyway. We stand here, together. We strengthen our defenses. We do what we must to guard the realms of men." Oh, Kyathol. Some recognized the echo of the old Night's Watch vow in his words, the shield that guards the realms of men. Though he had never formally spoken those words, he embodied their spirit now more than ever. The Direwolves, battered but unbroken, were living proof that their vow was needed. The settlement responded by organizing watchers at all hours. They began forging more weapons from the scraps of steel they had, rationing carefully, and searching the old records or half-remembered tales for any method to fight undead foes. Slowly, the nights bled into days, and days into nights. The vile stench on Ghost and Summer's fur faded as they healed from their wounds. Nymeria's leg mended in increments. At first she could barely stand, but over weeks she began to put weight on it. The bitterest part of winter wore on, giving way to a pale, half-hearted spring that never truly warmed the land, but at least softened the worst of the blizzards. The whites did not come, not immediately. Some settlers began to hope that the small nest they'd encountered was an isolated pocket, not the vanguard of a larger invasion. Life at Castle Black settled back into a tense routine. Yet none dared forget what they had seen in that cave. The knowledge that an ancient evil might be stirring again haunted their dreams. The Direwolves' vow persisted, unspoken but tangible in every measured paw-step along the ramparts. Ghost remained especially vigilant, patrolling the perimeter day and night, seldom resting. Shaggy Dog prowled even more aggressively than before, snapping at shadows. Summer helped guide hunting parties, though they rarely ventured too far. Nymeria, though still not fully recovered, reclaimed her fierce autonomy, patrolling the courtyard to keep the settlement safe from within. And Grey Wind's ghost was more visible than ever, flickering along the walls at twilight, as though bridging the boundary between living watchers and the dead they guarded against. Over time, the settlement grew used to a new normal, an uneasy peace overshadowed by the knowledge that beyond the horizon, something dreadful lurked. They found what joy they could. Children played, new couples formed, laughter echoed on mild afternoons. But always, the watch was maintained. The vow had deepened, no longer just the Direwolves' burden but that of every man and woman who chose to remain at Castle Black. The vow had become the settlement's own, to stand firm on the edge of the world, facing the unknown darkness, for as long as breath remained in their bodies. Gradually, new travelers arrived, each bringing stories of hardships elsewhere. A small group of free folk parted ways with their main clan, seeking the rumored safety of the Direwolves' domain. A pair of fisher folk from the shivering sea strayed inland, claiming that monstrous shapes had been spotted skimming the icy waters at night. Another merchant caravan came, more cautious than Hera's group had been, inquiring about trade possibilities. Each arrival was met with stringent rules, a thorough reading of the settlement's stance on the Direwolves, and the unwavering presence of Shaggy Dog's bared teeth. Yet the settlement could not turn away everyone, for each new face brought fresh skills or supplies. The man in the black cloak spent countless hours conferring with Thenner and other leaders, if such a word could be used in this ad hoc community. He also spent much time alone, climbing the wall to stare into the north. He would stand there, the wind buffeting him, thinking of Jon Snow, Bran Stark, Arya Stark, Rickon Stark, names from the past that the Direwolves once served. Where were those names and memories now, except in old tales? Yet the wolves endured, bridging eras, and forging a living link to a time when men and magic had allied to stave off oblivion. That alliance felt tenuous now, but it held enough power to keep them alive. On an evening of unexpected calm, the auroras shimmered once again across the sky, greenish ribbons edged with pale red. The entire settlement paused in their tasks to admire the spectacle. Children pointed, exclaiming that they saw running wolves up there. A hush fell as Shaggy Dog's howl rose from the top of a newly fortified tower. Summer answered from somewhere near the gate. Nymeria joined from the courtyard, her voice strong despite the lingering ache in her leg. Ghost lifted his muzzle, adding his own eerie lament. And then, from nowhere and everywhere, Grey Wind's spirit keened, a voice that transcended living breath. Men and women listened in reverence, hearts pounding. The howls wove together in an otherworldly chord that seemed to speak of duty, defiance, and the timeless bond uniting them all. It was a vow renewed under the moonlight, echoing off the colossal wall, carrying out across the plains and into the vast night. If any force of darkness stirred out there, the wolves' voices promised that they would meet it as they always had. Together, unyielding, resolute. As the pack's howling subsided, silence reigned, punctuated only by the snap of distant banners in the wind. Gradually people returned to their tasks, forging weapons, preparing meals, minding the children. The Direwolves went on with their patrols, slipping into the shadows to continue their eternal watch. The man in the black cloak gazed after them, feeling both small and profoundly connected to something larger than himself. Once, he had been just a wanderer. Now he stood among legends, part of a story that spanned centuries. So the cycle continued, with each season bringing fresh challenges and incremental triumphs. Under the guardianship of Ghost Nymeria, Shaggy Dog, Summer, and Grey Wind's ethereal presence, the men and women of Castle Black endured. Every storm that lashed their walls and every predator that tested their defenses was met with the same unspoken answer: we remain. We guard. Over the years that followed, some among the settlement died of age or sickness, their names carved onto wooden markers near the old weirwood carving in the shrine. Children came of age, taught from their earliest days to respect the wolf's domain, to honor the vow. Occasionally, bands of outlaws or raiders attempted to challenge them, lured by whispers of a fortress overshadowed by giant wolves. Such fools never lasted long against the combined might of men and direwolves united in purpose. Word spread ever further that Castle Black was a place both perilous and uniquely safe. A contradiction, perhaps, but no less true for that. Meanwhile, the deep north remained unsettled. Some who ventured far beyond the wall returned with chilling tales of glimpses of undead forms drifting among the white desolation, or frozen footprints leading nowhere. Others never returned at all. Yet no massive army of the dead materialized at the gates. If a new great other stirred in the frozen wastes, it seemed content for the moment to bide its time. The Watchers kept vigilant, never letting their guard drop. The old lessons from the legends of the long night had taught them the folly of complacency. One day, a new phenomenon appeared in the sky, an enormous, red-tinged comet that arched across the heavens, visible even in daylight. It lingered for weeks, trailing sparks like a crimson banner. The settlement's folk viewed it with awe or dread, depending on temperament. Some said it was a symbol of war yet to come. Others claimed it was the old god's blessing upon the vow. The Direwolves seemed agitated during those nights, pacing and howling more frequently. Some watchers on the wall insisted they saw shapes moving far out on the ice, but nothing ever approached. Tension simmered beneath daily routines like a half-buried ember. Amid that uneasy atmosphere, the man in the black cloak realized just how strongly he had come to love these people, these wolves, and this stark realm. He had no illusions about ever leaving. His life was here, shaped by the vow he had never formally taken but lived nonetheless. As he grew older, he found himself training younger settlers in the ways of vigilance, how to read wolf body language, how to navigate the labyrinthine corridors of the old castle, how to calm one's mind even when fear gnawed at the heart. He saw in their eyes the same spark that once lit his own, the fire that said, "I will stand against the darkness." Over time, a distinct culture and identity flourished within Castle Black's walls. They were neither Night's Watch nor just a random gathering of exiles. They called themselves simply the Watchers, in honor of a heritage they only half remembered but fully embraced. Some even embroidered small wolf emblems on their cloaks or shields, though there was no uniform as such. Songs emerged, blending wildling tunes with southern ballads, praising the Direwolves who guarded them all. Children learned to recite lines about Ghost, the White King of Wolves, and Nymeria, the fierce huntress, about Shaggy Dog's wrath, Summer's wisdom, and Grey Wind's silent lament. And always, the vow endured. The wolves had gathered here to guard the wall forever, and the people who lived under their protection did so as well. They kept that vow in spirit if not in the letter of an ancient oath. Even the ghosts of the old Night's Watch, men whose bones had long since turned to dust, seemed to hover in the corridors, whispering gratitude that the mission they once bore had not died with them. When storms battered the castle or new rumors of the undead spread, the Watchers steeled themselves, looking to the Direwolves for guidance. When good tidings came, like a successful hunt or the birth of a healthy child, the Watchers honored the wolves in thanks, sometimes leaving the choicest cuts of meat in the courtyard for them. It was not worship in the religious sense, but a deep reverence forged from shared survival. The boundary between man and beast was recognized, never crossed, for these were Direwolves, not domestic pets. Yet in their own wordless way, the wolves acknowledged the Watchers too, permitting them to exist in the Direwolves' domain. The man in the black cloak sometimes wondered how it would all end. Would the White Walkers eventually rise again in full force, forcing the final stand at the wall? Would the settlement flourish for generations, forging a new kingdom in the far north under the wolves' auspices? Or would the Watchers simply endure, silent and steadfast, as the centuries rolled on? Perhaps the vow was not about endings at all, but about the quiet daily act of guarding, of standing ready against a threat that might come tomorrow or 1,000 years from now. It was a concept that the younger watchers struggled with, the idea of vigilance without a guaranteed battle. Some thirsted for heroism, for a grand confrontation where they could prove their mettle and perhaps rid the world of the undead once and for all. But Ghost's calm presence, Summer's patient gaze, Nymeria's prowling wisdom, Shaggy Dog's feral watchfulness, and Grey Wind's spectral sorrow all spoke of a different path. That true guardianship is not a single glorious clash, but an unending stance, day after day, year after year, against whatever shadows might be gathering. In time, the man in the black cloak grew older still, his hair more salt than pepper, wrinkles marking his face. He walked with a slight limp from an old wound suffered during a raid. Yet he still climbed to the wall's top on good days, leaning on a staff, Ghost often at his side. The Direwolf too showed signs of the years. A few scars turned pale on his white fur, a more measured gait. Yet there was no weakness in those red eyes, only the same fierce determination that had defined him from the start. On one such day they stood overlooking the vastness of ice and snow, the wind biting and cold. The man in the black cloak recalled a childhood dream. He couldn't even remember it clearly, just the sense of having once looked upon the horizon with wonder. How far he had come since then, how unlikely this destiny. He patted Ghost's side gently, feeling the rumble of the wolf's breath. "We watch," he murmured, the words stolen by the wind. Ghost's ears perked, as if he understood. That night, the entire pack howled together once more, their voices blending with the watchers who had learned to join that chorus in their own way. Some on horns fashioned from ibex horns, others simply shouting their defiance into the night. The sound swelled, a testament to the bond that had been forged between Direwolves and humankind. And in the hush that followed, a solemn peace fell over Castle Black. Torches guttered in the courtyards, faint embers glowing like stars on earth. Snow drifted lazily, illuminated by moonlight. Somewhere in the darkness, a raven croaked, then fell silent. In that moment, the watchers felt the weight of centuries and the pull of the future converge. They knew, with certainty as cold as the wind off the wall, that so long as the Direwolves lived, the vow would stand. So long as there was breath in any watcher's lungs, the guard would not fail. The realm might never understand or acknowledge their labor, but that was irrelevant. They were beyond the politics and crowns of the South. This was the edge of the world, where the boundary between life and death wore thin, and only the constant vigilance of wolves and men kept the night at bay. Seasons turned again. A generation passed, then another. Some watchers departed, seeking a life less harsh. Others arrived, drawn by the legends that had grown over the years. The settlement changed faces, but its core identity endured. Children who were once babes toddling around the courtyard grew into strong hunters, skilled in reading direwolf moods. Greybeards told stories of the Cave of Whites, of Nymeria's near-fatal wound, of Shaggy Dog's harrowing hunts, of Summer's silent counsel, of Ghost's regal leadership. And always, they recalled the ghost of Grey Wind, gliding through the corridors at night, as a reminder that the line between this world and the next was thinner at the wall than anywhere else. Sometime during those years, the man in the black cloak took ill. It was a lingering sickness, perhaps pneumonia or something akin, not easily cured in the harsh north. He fought it for days, lying near the hearth in his chamber, a space that had once been the Lord Commander's quarters, long abandoned until the watchers repurposed it. He coughed violently, each spasm jolting pain through his chest. Watchers and wildlings tended to him as best they could, offering herbal infusions, but the fever would not break. Outside, a storm raged, howling winds burying the castle in fresh drifts. Ghost remained by his bedside, refusing to leave even for hunts. If a watcher tried to coax the wolf away, Ghost growled softly, unmoving. In his fevered dreams, the man in the black cloak saw visions of the Direwolves' history, of Grey Wind running beside Robb Stark, of a young Arya with Nymeria at her heels, of Bran riding on Summer's back, of Rickon laughing as Shaggy Dog chased him through the halls, of Jon Snow forging his bond with Ghost. Faces blurred, shifting in out of focus, blending with the present. The vow thrummed like a heartbeat in his mind. He was only a caretaker, a link in the chain. The vow belonged to the wolves, and the wolves belonged to the north, as eternal as the snows. One quiet morning, he opened his eyes, the fever broken at last. Weak sunlight filtered through the cracks of the shuttered window. The storm had calmed. Ghost lay curled next to him, radiating warmth. With effort, the man in the black cloak reached out, placing a trembling hand on the wolf's neck. "Still here," he whispered, voice raspy. Ghost lifted his head, ears twitching, and gazed at him with unblinking red eyes. In that gaze the man saw acceptance, of life, of death, of whatever might come. The vow did not end with one man's passing. It transcended individuals, binding wolves and watchers across generations. He recovered slowly, rising from his bed after many days, thinner and weaker, but alive. When he ventured into the courtyard, leaning on a walking stick, the watchers cheered softly, relieved their leader had not died. He nodded in gratitude, overwhelmed by how many people now called Castle Black home. Staring at the worn faces, some older, some younger, he understood that the vow had become a collective inheritance. Each watcher, each child, each new arrival who embraced this place was part of a continuum stretching back to the ancient days of the first men and the Direwolves who fought at their side. As the years continued to pass, the once man in the black cloak grew old in truth, hair bone-white, steps unsteady. He no longer climbed to the top of the wall, leaving that to the younger watchers. Yet he remained a guiding presence, retelling the old stories to keep memory alive. When asked about the future, he would say only, "The wolves will guide us. They always have." And so it went, with life and death, comings and goings, births and funerals, triumphs and defeats, all woven into the tapestry of Castle Black under the watchful eyes of Ghost, Nymeria, Shagadog, Summer, and the ever-present specter of Grey Wind. New threats sometimes emerged. A vicious raider chieftain who thought to overwhelm the fortress, a harsh famine that struck after an unseasonably early frost, an outbreak of sickness that claimed a handful of lives. Yet each time, unity prevailed. The vow held them together. When swords failed, the wolves' fangs did not. When men's resolve wavered, the wolves' howls rekindled it. By now, no one doubted that a direwolf's presence at the gates meant a defense stronger than any drawbridge or moat. Eventually, the day came when the old man in the black cloak could no longer rise from his bed. He lay there, breath shallow, surrounded by watchers young and old. In the quiet hush of those final hours, Ghost padded in and settled beside him, muzzle resting on the bed. The old man mustered a faint smile, placing a trembling hand on the wolf's head. The watchers lingered in the doorway, many weeping softly. Outside, the wind was mercifully calm, the sky a pale gray. No fanfare, no grand eulogy. Just a final hush as the old man drifted into sleep and never woke again. They buried him with simple rites, near the weirwood carving in the shrine. A hush blanketed the ceremony, broken only by Nymeria's low whine, Shagadog's uneasy pacing, Summer's mournful posture, and Ghost's silent vigil. Grey Wind's spirit appeared at the edge of the crowd, luminous and still. Some watchers swore they saw the old man's shade rise, embraced by Grey Wind's spectral form, before fading into the swirling snow. Whether that was truth or the imaginings of grief, none could say. But afterward Ghost lifted his head to the sky and howled, a long, keening note of farewell. The other wolves joined, their voices echoing off the wall, carrying the vow forward into the unknown. The watchers raised their voices too in their own rough human manner. It was a chorus of loyalty and sorrow, of remembrance and resolve. Life at Castle Black went on. A new group of watchers took the lead, forging alliances with other small enclaves in the north. They maintained trade routes with distant towns, shared knowledge of forging steel, grew what meager crops they could. The Direwolves remained the heart of it all, as though an unbroken line stretched from the earliest Starks to these watchers of the new age. The ghost of Grey Wind still roamed the nights, a sentinel beyond mortal constraints. Generations rose and fell, each learning and then teaching the next that the vow was a living thing, not just words recited in the dark. And so, in that far northern stronghold, the Direwolves continued their eternal guard. Whenever the sun dipped below the horizon and the skies glittered with stars or the swirling colors of auroras, the 5 shapes could be seen, or 4 shapes and 1 wraith, pacing the ramparts or roaming the snowy expanses. They howled to the moon, to the land, to the memory of lost kin, weaving their own story through the silent winter nights. And the watchers listened, hearts stirred by that ancient music, reminded that they stood upon a threshold between life and an ever-lurking darkness. The vow was older than all of them, etched into the marrow of direwolves and men who remembered the old ways. In the centuries that followed, bards and storytellers would sometimes spin tales of a white wolf named Ghost, who led all the Direwolves to stand forever at the wall. They spoke of a realm in the far north where men and wolves lived in harmony, bound by an oath that transcended mortality. Skeptics in southern courts rolled their eyes, dismissing such legends as superstition. Still, once in a great while, a wanderer or merchant caravan returned from the north bearing glimpses of the truth, a fleeting vision of massive wolves atop a fortress, or the memory of haunting howls echoing over an endless sea of snow. Regardless of who believed and who scoffed, the vow continued. The Direwolves, children of ancient magic, never forgot. Their watch became a living myth, renewed each day by the footprints in the snow, by the hunts at dusk, by the howls that shook the stars. No threat of men, no scorn from distant lords, no cynicism of maesters could undo what had taken root. The vow persisted in teeth and fur, in watchfires and humble shrines, in legends retold at hearth and campsite. Should the day ever come when the darkness rose again in full, the watchers and wolves would stand as they always had, side by side, bound by something deeper than blood, older than kingdoms, a promise to guard the realms of men and to remind the world that sometimes the old bonds forged in sorrow and steel can outlast the ephemeral ambitions of crowns. For here, at the edge of the world, ghostly and living direwolves ruled, and beneath the hush of swirling snow, one could almost hear the vow beating like a quiet drum in the distance. We are here. We remember. We stand guard. Forever.